Hey everybody, this is I Read Old Magazines. Please like and subscribe. We had to move over to this because I'm an idiot and I can't figure out how to use the natural streaming thing for YouTube. So I hope everybody gets over here. Everybody might be waiting in that other waiting room, but hopefully this has confused the Jay Dyer trolls and they'll stay in there and keep downvoting even though YouTube won't let them. Uh, YouTube's not letting them downvote because I'm a Fed, just like we've read the documents. Um, so this video is devoted to misconceptions about Plato, why Jay Dyer is wrong about Plato, why most people don't understand Plato. Um, a lot of it's going to revolve around the LaRouche movement's work on Plato, but you have to understand the reason for this is because the LaRouche movement actually produced their own, especially which talks about ontology and epistemology. The movement. Can everybody hear me? Okay, is it all good? I think it is. I think it looks like it's all good on the indicator here. Um, First of all, like and subscribe. Like this video. The Jay Dyer Troll Farm. Like this video too. Let me know that you're watching and that you hate me. If you hate me, hit the thumbs up. If you like me, hit the thumbs up. All right. But the LaRouche movement published their own translations because the oldest English translations of Plato were done by Benjamin Jowett, who is a romanticist and purposely obscured Plato to tie into his romantic conception of Atlantis, and we're going to talk about that later on. But that Jay Dyer's understanding of Plato is not the Augustinian understanding of Plato. It's not the Platonist understanding of Plato, but rather these different Neoplatonist cultists and Neoplatonic understandings of Plato, as opposed to the actual Platonic tradition, and as opposed to what the uh, Plato even says. Oftentimes, people try to quote people that are not the Socratic or Platonic character in the dialogues as the opinions of Plato. And one of the things that you get is this accusation that Plato was a pederast, and we're going to deal with that too, or that he advocated pederasty, when in fact the Athenian stranger in Laws denies that. But this is fundamental to Jay Dyer's understanding of the Barlamite Palamas conflict, as well as his understanding of absolute divine simplicity, which is actually the understanding of various heretics, and not Thomism, not real Thomism. Um, it is actually the understanding of Hegel, um, and you have to realize that this channel revolves around this concept of traditionalism as actually being something derived from Kantianism, and the entire Counter-Enlightenment U-Turn, which says we reject reason, and therefore we have to go back to basically religious cult systems. And in reality, there's no real ability to know God through reason. We have to have revelation, all of these things primary to reason, when in actuality they are kind of these simultaneous things that exist. Um, and we'll get into that too. Other things, I've had the Jay Dyer troll farm attacking me lately. Some of them have called me a soy boy, which is funny because I don't think that I fall into that category at all. Um, I'm actually on the repeat diet. And I've kind of come to the conclusion that the carnivore dieters around Jay Dyer and Tristan from Primal Edge are the soy boys of the alt right. And that both of these groups, the soy boys and vegetarians on the left, are people that they eat according to their ego ideal as well as their philosophical background, and so that the traditionalists tend to fall into the camp of wanting to be cavemen who triumph of the will can kind of overcome reason and scientific eating, and so they want to go back to this primal, non-existent hunter-gatherer society, which never existed. Um, it never existed as this kind of self uh, perpetuating idea that, oh, we have to be hunter gatherers, we can't be agricultural, we can't be processing foods. Every society tends towards that, except for ones that have been locked into extremely low population density. Um, but then the soy boys, because they just believe that everything is this product of evolutionary processes, that they're just mixing different chemicals with their body is no problem at all because their body isn't perfect to begin with. So you have on both sides these people that are just trying to reach ego ideals and trying to reach or generated from their philosophies, their diets. And the carnivore dieters around Jay Dyer and wait, is Tristan from Primal Edge. I mean, Tristan looks like the Coomer from the Coomer memes, and these guys have these wild eyes and these red faces from over methylation. You can look at pictures before they went on the primal diet, and you can see that they have disappearing eyebrows, which is a common sign of the eyebrows shorten. It's a common sign of endocrine thyroid disorders. And this is partially because they avoid sugar and all of this, but I don't have time to get into that. The fact of the matter is, through ketosis based diets, they are essentially estrogenizing their systems, and they probably have a lot of estradiol flowing through their bodies, which is the highest oxidative form of estrogen and the most potent. So they might have some sort of testosterone boost, but they also have the most potent form of estrogen running through their bodies. Now these guys are too stupid to figure that out. They're too simp. But it's based on this idea that they kind of reject reason and science and instead replace it with you know what can either be called the Dostoevsky Project, which became the authoritarian personality project of George Lukács of the Frankfurt School, um, which can also be described as the New Dark Ages of the Fabian Socialists, or the Archaic Revival, which is another major name for this program, among all the Kantian derivative groups that spurn out of Paris, out of the Russian circles um, around Martinism, and the Fabian group in Britain. Uh, but that was one major thing. I just had like a eureka moment, and I had to bring that up. So we're gonna get on to. Oh well, yeah. Let me explain the icon too. This will be the future of various shows, but Konstantin Malafiev, who works directly for the Russian Institute for Strategic Studies under a former KGB general, um, Leonid Reshetnikov, who also has stated that he rejects Alexander Dugin's Eurasianist policies, but that Dugan is essentially an attack dog against the West and in a program to destroy the West. So I have posted on Twitter at Reason Power, which you can see on the icon. There's a chart, updated chart of the connections between Jay Dyer's major influences. And we've also established that Mark Hackard, who is this guy who cites Seraphim Rose and Berdyaev and Joseph de Maistre as his major influences, Mark Hackard was one of the initiators, I think, of Dyer's. Um, I mean, he was a major promoter of Dyer. He's in these circles around New Eastern Outlook and all of the groups that are supported by Constantine Malafiev. But it's interesting because Hackard's entire family are Jesuits. Hackard went to Georgetown, or they're Jesuit spawn. They're students of Georgetown, which has an interesting background in itself with ROCOR image. Um, if you know the story of George de Morgenschild and Lee Harvey Oswald being within the white Russian emigre in the house where the Romanovs escaped to in New York. Um, there's interesting connections between the Kennedy assassination and ROCOR, but then there's also that Jesuit faction around the Georgetown set, which is central to this issue. So, um, I mean, it sounds like I'm just spurting out a bunch of crap, uh, but it's a lot of stuff to go through. So I'm trying to summarize it. Um, but Mark Hackard's family, his sister was a Georgetown alumnus. The guy she married came from Loyola University, and he also works for the Hackard Law Corporation, which employs, I think, all three of them. And Mark Hackard's father is a big Catholic um, Jesuit uh, charitable guy and served on the board of trustees of Jesuit High School in Sacramento. Um, so it's very strange, uh, ostensibly, that this Jesuit guy is uh, so supportive of Dyer. Dyer owns this guy's website. What the hell is it called? I get it mixed up with New Eastern Outlook. I have it right here. Soul of the East. Um, but Hackard uh, is influencing all this orthodoxy stuff through Soul of the East. And Kant, Kierkegaard, Dostoevsky, Joseph de Maistre. Well, why is this? Well, because the Jesuits were co-founded by the Doge of Venice. Venice had always considered itself a separate patriarchate from the Roman Pontiff, and were always kind of this parallel empire to the Byzantines and romanticized the Byzantines. And from that, you get the new Jesuit outlook. Especially during Vatican II, where the Jesuits were promoting the de-Latinization of the Mass, simultaneously promoting the traditional uh, Eastern Orthodox Church and Eastern Catholic Church. And it was not just a means of, it wasn't just a means of ecumenism, it was the fact that the Jesuits um, were partially infiltrated by the KGB, but that the Jesuits come from a line of Christian existentialism that comes from Kierkegaard, Heidegger, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, which becomes liberation theology. But they also have this ancient, archaic connection to the Orthodox Church. And so that was one of the various connections I have. You can take a look at the chart, it's on the Twitter um, page at Reason Power, at Reason underscore power. And you also have the connections spelled out between Gurdjieff and Peter Ouspensky, Dmitry Matronovic, Alan Watts, the Seraphim Rose. Alan Watts was also a disciple of Berdiev, who spawns all of the ROCOR emerge around St. Vladimir um, Seminary. And then you have the connections between Rene Guénon, Yevgeny Golovin, and Alexander Dugan, also Gurdjieff there. It shows about Herman, and that he brings in the Rosicrucian Holy Order of Mans into the Orthodox Church, and he co-founds both St. Herman of Alaska Monastery with Seraphim Rose, and he was also integral part of Father Seraphim Rose's bookstore and Seraphim Rose's translator. And Seraphim Rose's daughter actually accuses Seraphim Rose of being a homosexual, and possibly that Abbot Herman who was a convicted pedophile, um, was a lifetime collaborator and possible lover with Seraphim Rose. So take a look at that, and we're going to go on. Let me check any comments in the chat. Hey, John Brisson here. Sorry I haven't gotten back to you, John. I've been extremely busy, but I'm glad you're watching. Tony G, I attend Latin Mass. Thank you very much. Okay, there's John giving me some nutritional insight. I will have to speak with John later on his opinions more in depth on Ray Pete. But here's okay, so let's start with the Plato issue. So Jay Dyer on the past in promoting the typical accusations against Plato, one that he's a homosexual and promotes homosexuality. This is actually not a fact. Here's a quote. One certainly should not fail to observe what when male unites with female for procreation, the pleasure experience is held to be due to nature, but contrary to nature when male mates with male or female with female, and that those first guilty of such enormities, the Cretans, were impelled by their slavery to pleasure, and we all accuse the Cretans of concocting the story of Ganymede, which I believe is Zeus or one of the Roman gods abducts another Roman god for rape. The Athenian stranger in Plato's law blames pederasty for promoting civil strife and driving many to their wits' end, and recommends the prohibition of sexual intercourse with youths, laying out a path whereby this may be accomplished. And the Athenian stranger is the Platonic Socratic character. And sometimes people, especially in Timaeus, they quote Parmenides, who is an opponent to Plato, as uh, forwarding the ideas of Plato. And it's stupid. These are the ideas that Socrates, Plato are opposing. And it's so stupid. It wouldn't be a dialogue if you didn't have these contrary viewpoints leading them into ad absurdum in suggesting a solution for the paradox. But people don't understand that. The actual roots of pederasty in the church, because Jay Dyer also accuses this Platonic tradition as being the origin of. He's made this claim before. I don't know where the influence on the Catholic Church for pederasty and all that. It actually corresponds with the Bogomil Albigensian cult, people who called themselves the Bianchi. And this is also the origins of the flagellant heresy that you see during the Dark Ages, led by St. Vincent Ferrer, which the papacy at Avignon actually put an end to. One of the good things about Avignon. They identified this cult as related to the priesthood of Baal. But these people also believe that sexual relations between men and women were sinful, and therefore sodomy was an alternative. They believe that it was sinful because in the deranged world after the fall, reproduction was forwarding the material world. And these ideas permeate in both the East and West. In the East, you get things like the Toll House theory, and which Father Seraphim Rose promoted, and you get what many ROCOR monks and Mount Athos monks teach to various laymen, that sexual relations with women is evil. The clerical celibacy in the West is generally looked down upon for political reasons. It's suggested already to maintain celibacy, but the level of nepotism in the Roman Church had to be cured by a political move, which was mandatory celibacy for the priesthood. Now, honestly, that could change. I don't see how reason doesn't necessitate, and neither does tradition of the church or scripture, mandatory celibacy. It's a matter of prudence, but it's not something that's explicitly or very clear needs to be, um, forever sealed. But obviously, people will misuse this, and obviously, um, it could be used as a wrecking ball to bring down the church the rest of the way. So, you know, it's one of those things where in more moral times you could probably implement it, but now is not the time. Um, Jay has tons of um, unscrupulous kinds of criticisms and things that are uh, just disproven if you actually look deeper into. And a lot of Orthodox people agree with this. They think that Jay Dyer is a completely off the handle meme. So one of the major issues too is Jay lies about Vatican I. Um, the dogmatic constitution of Vatican I, Filius Dei, contradicts this Oracle of Delphi understanding of the papacy that was uh, promoted by the traditionalists in the 19th century in the Counter-Enlightenment. Um, Jay tries to make, just like the SSPX and just like all of these people, they try to make papal infallibility into a tool by which they can say, well, the Pope that we like said this, so therefore, blah, blah, blah. It's not that easy. Papal infallibility is not a statement of law, it's a statement of fact. So it's not saying what you should do, even if it says Vatican I. It's saying objectively what you should do. It does not say subjectively every single statement of the Pope. Um, Under the teaching authority of the Pope, um, what's the major distinction that everybody gets wrong too? Both the teaching and the official documents, have to be followed. But that doesn't mean every single thing has to be followed, because then a lie. If the Pope intends to lie, you can't. That's stupid. Um, it's the Oracle of Delphi understanding it of the papacy, and that's wrong. Um, the dogmatic constitution of Vatican I rejects the idea that only tradition alone can be used um, to understand the teaching of the church and to come up with new dogma. Uh, Traditionalism denied that human reason by itself had the power to attain any truths in the domains of knowledge, of the metaphysical, moral, and religious. It arose mainly in Belgium and France as a reaction to the 18th century rationalism and can be considered an extreme form of anti-rationalism. This is part of the de Maestrian Kantian U-Turn. Its chief proponents were Joseph de Maistre, who was the Martinist founder of Catholic traditionalism, espoused by such people as E. Michael Jones, although E. Michael Jones is much more. I think Michael Jones is fairly rational. Um, he just has these kinds of artifacts of Joseph de Maistre, but there's other people like the radical monarchist Michael Voris, or that idiot that runs around with kind of a Confederate coat of arms, Sir Charles Coulomb. Yeah, but also the school of Uriage, the Vichyite French, and um, accordingly, many of the SSPX individuals. There's also Louis de Bonald who promoted this, and he was the founder of the monarchist sociology that diffused down the line and is pretty much the championed by the Evolian fascist Allo de Benoit. And there's also Huis Robert de Lamennais, who founded the liberal Catholic Church, despite being a traditionalist. Um, you have to realize, two sides of the same coin. If you break with reason, um, it's going to cause this radical left and right, which has no connection back to God. Their doctrines were advocated in a modified form by blah blah blah, the philosophers of the Louvain school. The fundamental distrust of human reason underlying traditionalism was eventually condemned in a number of papal decrees and finally ruled out of the dogmatic Constitution Dei Filius during the First Vatican Council in 1870. Um, Other issues, I mean, you can't read papal infallibility that way. I kind of touched on it before, but as a matter of law, like the intent has to be there to teach the truth. And if the Pope lies or he isn't doing due diligence, or if he's speaking out of place, he can't speak the truth, um, or it's not binding statement. And you can, Jay Dyer can say, well, this person said here or this document said here. A legalistic interpretation of the truth is still not. It breaks with reason. It is part of this cancer of traditionalism of the Kantian Demetrian U-turn. You cannot accept those kinds of statements. Um, the idea is that the statement first has to be true. It has to be continuation of tradition. It has to be in accordance with reason. Uh, there's a bunch of predecessors or prior what the fuck's it called, conditions that have to be fulfilled before it can be considered and before it can be perpetuated. This is just simply this is reason. This is what is required to understand theology in the first place. And anyway, I don't care to go into that anymore. That can be a separate subject. But you have to take away the main point that this document that is supposed to be the contextualizing document for the rest of the Vatican I documents is oftentimes forgotten, and people just read this doctrine of papal infallibility without reading the Constitution. And it is the Constitution of the Council that provides the contextualization for the rest of the documents. So people who read into papal infallibility against the Constitution uh, are essentially lying. Now, on to Plato. The first major misinterpreter of Plato is someone called Proclus. And we're going to read an article from Fidelio magazine called Plato's Method versus Neo-Platonism. John M. Dillon is commended for contemplating this first ever English translation of Proclus' commentary on Plato's Parmenides, after Glenn Morrow, who had translated nearly half of it, died in 1973. The only previous translation on this work into any modern language was published in 1900 in German. Therefore, this translation is extremely valuable, not because Proclus provides us with a valid interpretation of Plato's dialogue, which he does not, but rather for two other reasons. First, it has historical value in light of the fact that Plato's Parmenides dialogue, like most of Plato's writings, with the exception of Timaeus, was not itself available in the Latin West, even during the lifetime of Cardinal Nicholas of Cusa. Therefore, Proclus' work, which was probably translated into Latin in 1280s, was the sole means by which this critical dialogue of Plato was available to Renaissance thinkers, including Cusanus. Second, even though the Neoplatonic method employed by Proclus leads him to an erroneous interpretation of Plato's dialogue as a whole, it nonetheless serves a useful negative function. Proclus' attempt to derive positive philosophical system from Parmenides is clearly not the intent of Plato's dialogue, nor does it reflect Plato's own method. And Proclus' commentary is therefore a useful contrast from a methodological standpoint to the approach taken to Plato's Parmenides in the recent period by Lyndon LaRouche in such locations as his In Defense of Common Sense in Project A. Now, why are we using LaRouche? LaRouche today has all sorts of negative um, kind of political unions that he's formed. Um, Obviously, he's dead, but the movement lives on. Now is closer to the CNP um, and people which they once predominantly opposed. Um, I don't want to get into a whole spiel about this, But the LaRouche movement centered itself after the 1975 or so on Platonism. As they realized that how stupid Marxism was, they realized the Platonic roots of Leibniz, of the American Revolution, etc., and the Aristotelian roots of the people who were promoting a new dark age, the destruction of the West, the destruction of industrial capitalism. Um, they went to the trouble of translating, making new translations of Platonic works. And I would find it pretty silly to not take them seriously on this issue. They've also translated, Pierre Boudry's translated Leibniz's work on calculus, which there's no other English translation available. Um, they did a lot of good translating work. And because of their background, because they're not romantics, because they look towards reason as something which is a God given gift to understand the world rather than some sort of thing that is an enemy of both God and the world, um, I believe that they're the most trustworthy individuals for something like this. Um, and the fact that the very people that translated it, the Kronbergs, did have some disagreements with LaRouche, um, but in general, the ideas around the Parmenides paradox and all of this, they corrected a lot of the deliberate falsifications by Benjamin Jowett and the people around John Ruskin. Um, things like logos, Benjamin Jowett would replace with tale, like a story, um, which is a absolutely terrible falsification. Logos, reason, logos, word is logos is actually reason, and the Christian concept of logos is Christ Himself. But there is this kind of analogy, analog between those two things. But we got to continue. The immediate thing that one notices about Proclus' commentary is that despite its length, it extends only to the end of the dialogue's first hypothesis, or less than half the extent of the whole. From the first hypothesis, Proclus constructs a Neoplatonic metaphysical system. The first hypothesis of Parmenides is, if there is one, the one will not be many. From this hypothesis, Proclus derives the idea of a transcendent God who is beyond being and therefore prior to anything created. Although he does not comment at length on the second hypothesis, he does make reference to it. So the orthodox hesychast idea, and remember, I'm not attacking orthodoxy, I'm attacking neo-orthodoxy, which revived hesychasm and all of these ideas during the Enlightenment, where there had been a giant gap between widely accepting Gregory Palamas or discussing the ideas of Palamas, and we'll read about that later. There was this huge gap. Um, and as soon as these ideas come into Europe, you have this immediate, you have basically the rise of Bolshevism and the messianic idea of Russia promoted by Solyev and Dostoevsky. And the two are intricately connected. But anyway, this is the Neo Orthodox idea that God is beyond being. And we'll get, in that's one of the major arguments against absolute divine simplicity within Thomism. Going on. Although he does not comment at length on the second hypothesis, he does make reference to it. The second hypothesis is if a one is, it cannot be and yet not have being. If a one is, it cannot be and yet not have being. The one which is therefore both a one and a many. While not endorsing Proclus' method, nor his interpretation of the Parmenides per se, to which he had no direct access, Nicholas of Cusa, referring explicitly to Proclus' commentary in such locations as On the Origin, a work in 1459, and On the Other, 1462, argued on behalf of a notion of God, the absolute one, as not other, for example, as not many, in the contradistinction to the universe it transcends, which, being created, having being, is both one in likeness of the absolute one and also other or many. There's a fascinating passage in Proclus' commentary which is coherent with Cousinos' notion that the not other or God is the other of the other. For example, or for illustration, is not only transcendent but also immanent in his creation. Citing Plato's letters, Proclus writes, "A divine light is kindled in us, through which there comes about in such a way as is possible a glimpse of it, which makes us participate in it in respect of that part of ourselves that is most divine. But the most divine thing in us is the one in us, which Socrates called the illumination of the soul, just as he called the truth itself light. This illumination is our individual light, and so, if it is not impious to say this, here also like is apprehensible by like, as the sensible is by sensation, the opinable by opinion, the knowledge knowable by science, so by the one in ourselves do we apprehend the one, which by the brightness of its light is the cause of all beings, by which all participate in the one." This is the idea of imago vivo Dei, man living in the image of God. The idea that man is a reflection of God, and that they have this inverse but complementary relationship. On the one hand, Cousinos criticized Proclus for his attempt to construct a rational defense of the existence of the multitude of pagan gods through his doctrine of Henads. Cousinos' concept of the absolute one as triune and creative is totally in conflict with Proclus' notion of the absolute one, is not the intelligible Father who causes all things. For according to Proclus, the primal God is the generator of the plurality of gods, only some of whom are fathers. Lyndon LaRouche, who has been able to study the Parmenides directly, arrives at the same conclusions concerning the dialogue with Cousinus, was able to distill from Proclus' methodologically erroneous commentary. Whereas Proclus interprets the Parmenides as the allegorical expression of the positive philosophical system, LaRouche correctly sees the dialogue as a polemic against the Eleatic. I pronounced this before I started this stream. Still can't. Eleatic school of philosophy represented by Parmenides and Zeno. For LaRouche, what Plato does in the Parmenides is to demonstrate the absurd and self-contradictory conclusions to which one is led by deductive secession from the axiomatic assumptions of the philosophy of Parmenides, in which the one is conceived as static or linear. So the Socratic method is not Zeno and Diogenes and all these people. Diogenes just made everything into a joke. Zeno led everybody into ad absurdum. But the unique factor in Socratic philosophy is that you shepherd people towards a realization that their ideas are wrong, and you shepherd them towards the ideas that are right through dialogue. So it is not simply, as a lot of people, any sort of work that they don't like, or a work that would be damning by somebody that they do like, if it was serious, they call it a satire. Um, there's a lot of works out there that people will say, well, St. Thomas More's Utopia was just a satire. And I don't know if that's true or not, but I don't think it is. Uh, or they'll say something like Plato's Republic was just a satire. And it's so ridiculous because uh, what differentiates Socrates from Diogenes or Socrates from Zeno? This isn't the point. There's a higher purpose in these dialogues. Plato would not just found an academy based on the idea of satire. LaRouche argues, in effect, that what Plato proves in Parmenides' dialogue is precisely the same thing that Cousinus proves in On Squaring the Circle. In the latter, Cousinus shows that the perimeter of the polygon can never be made coextensive with that of a circle by the method of exhaustion. In fact, the more sides the polygon has, the more points it has at which it is distant from the circle. Similarly, as long as Parmenides assumes that the unity is incapable of qualitative change and rather measurable by simple linear extensions, his attempt to find the relationship of the many to the one will necessarily fail. Although Proclus removed the real Plato entirely from the commentary, it is the concept of the absolute creator of the universe as capable of qualitative change and of man as capable of effecting qualitative change through the use of reason, all implicit in Plato's devastating polemic against Parmenides' linearity, which eluded him, and which LaRouche used the method of Cusanus and Plato has found. So that might be a little esoteric. Nicholas of Cusa was one of the main guys behind the Council of Florence, and essentially was in agreement with Palamas on the essence energy distinction. And well, how could somebody who is aware of the essence, that's a question posed. We will talk more about Nicholas of Cusa in later shows, but there's kind of the Neoplatonic school behind Proclus and how they misunderstood Plato as kind of this Kabbalistic system, um, where you have a system where there's only that are fathers and then other ones that are emanations, essentially. Um, Next comes the Hegelian interpretation, Kantianism. Uh, Dugan is a Hegelian Kantian, follower of Heidegger, somebody who, because of this distinction between reason, um, or this rejection of reason, Dugan makes a distinction between being, ontological being, and being in the world. And this is a big concept also with Christian existentialism, liberation theology, etc. But it's also um, very close to Neo-Orthodoxy and the reasons why one might become Orthodox. Um, it's kind of this distinction too between created graces and graces being God itself. Um, we'll read more about this. You might be able to see what's going on here. But that's part of Dugan's Eurasian philosophy. Well, there's the same thing. Um, and his fourth political theory. It's pretty essential to that. It's kind of dense. But if we look into Hegel and Kant, you might understand it a little bit more, where this springs out of. So here's a criticism of Hegel and Kant by Heinrich Heine. I posted some of these quotes on my Twitter. But remember that Kant and Joseph de Maistre, the traditionalists, all these people in the Counter-Enlightenment that rejected reason, um, caused a U-turn in philosophy and the advancement of civilization. Now, the Enlightenment itself, under the empiricists, did the same thing, but they also rejected reason. This is the fraud, is that the people in the salons that caused the later stages of the French Revolution were all basically disciples of um, the physiocrats, the empiricists. Kant himself was motivated by the Enlightenment thinker Hume. And so they're actually themselves part of the system, and um, they're actually rejecting Christianity and rejecting reason, but they're selling it to you as um, that the Renaissance caused this entire problem and that we have to go back to the Dark Ages when most people were incapable of reading and therefore had extremely diminished reason. And here's Heinrich Heine's warnings on Kant and Hegel. Did you notice I have already committed a sacrilege? Yes, indeed, Kant and Hegel belong before the bench of justice against humanity for incitement of violence and terrorism, and the prosecution's witness I can call as Heinrich Heine. Just a minute, imposes a good German. How can you make such accusations? These men and philosophers, they fought with ideas, not swords and cannons. Precisely. That is why this is such a serious case. Intellectual weapons can have far more devastating effects than military ones. But here's Heinrich Heine to clarify this for you further. And here's Heinrich Heine. I shall now speak of man whose very name has the power of exorcism. I shall speak of Immanuel Kant. It is said that nocturnal spirits are terrified at the sight of the executioner's sword. How terrified they must be, then, someone who holds up to them Kant's critique of pure reason. This book is the sword with which deism was executed in Germany. Now, a note on deism. Deism is the idea that one can be religious, but secular society must believe in the existence of God. Now, with Kantianism, this becomes a choice because reason doesn't exist. You're either with us or you're against us. And this is kind of the George Bush statement with the Iraq War, but it's which comes from the German conservative revolution, which draws back to Kant. It's this Manichaeanism, this Manichaean dialectic. I'm sorry, I ate 3 eggs today because it's Lent, so I don't have much energy. But deism is so attacked by these people that are promoting the new Dark Ages and traditionalism and all of this. But deism was the idea that you must believe in God, and you must believe in basically Hegel's or Leibniz, best of all possible worlds. Of course, now it's attacked as liberal and et cetera, et cetera. And instead, you have this dialectic where you're either a nihilist or you're an orthodox fundamentalist, and anything in between is approaching atheism if you're not a orthodox fundamentalist. So, going on. If, however, Immanuel Kant, the arch destroyer in the realm of ideas, far surpassed Maximilian Robespierre in terrorism, yet he had possessed many similarities with the latter. We find in both the same talent for suspicion, only the one directs his suspicion towards ideas and calls it criticism, while the other applies it to people and entitles it to republican virtue. But both represented in the highest degree the type of provincial bourgeois. Nature had destined them to weigh coffee and sugar, but fate determined that they should weigh other things and placed on the scales of the one a king, on the scales of the other God. So, saying these are people that are pampered academics that turn into political leaders, and one uh, is responsible for the assassination of the king, and Kant is responsible for the assassination of God. The German Revolution will not turn out to be any milder or gentler because it was preceded by Kant's critique, or even Hegel's natural philosophy. Because of these doctrines, revolutionary forces have developed which only await the day when they can break forth and fill the world with terror and astonishment. Kantians will appear who have no more use for piety in the physical world than in the world of ideas, who with sword and axe will mercilessly rummage in the soil of our European culture in order to eradicate the last roots of the past. But the Hegelian nature philosophers would be more terrifying than anybody else, since they would actively take part in the German Revolution and would identify themselves with the work of destruction. If the hand of the Kantian strikes a strong, unerring blow because his heart is not moved by the traditional reverence, the philosopher of nature will be terrifying because he allies himself with the primitive powers of nature, can conjure up demonic forces of ancient German pantheism, and therefore awaken in him the lust for battle which we find among the ancient Germans, and which fights not in order to destroy nor in order to win, but simply in order to fight. The thought precedes the deed as lightning precedes thunder. German thunder is, of course, truly German. It is not very nimble, but rumbles along slowly. There will be played in Germany a drama compared to which the French Revolution might seem merely an innocent idyll. And this actually predicts Nazism, and Heinrich Heine addresses this. I was very severe in my religion and philosophy in Germany because I wanted to deliver a clear warning. I would not have believed that my poetic prophecies could have taken on such a ghastly reality in the 20th century. It is far worse that you, standing at the end of the blood-stained century, have failed to grasp my warning. You cheerfully persist in falling into the ruptures over evil because you claim you know too little to distinguish it from good. This too is supposed to be typically German. Here is what I said at the time about the Germans' public response to Kant. Did Kant, perhaps just by destroying all the proofs for the existence of God, intend to show us clearly how perilous it is not to be able to know anything about the existence of God? In this matter, he acted almost as wisely as the Westphalian friend of mine who had smashed all the street lamps in Gronder Street in Göttingen, and then, standing in the dark, delivered a long lecture to us about the practical necessity of lamps, which he had broken in a theoretical frame of mind only in order to show us that we could see nothing without them. And this is the kind of theological proofs that the Dyerites and all these people against natural theology are promoting. Is, well, we have to destroy reason based on these Kantian justifications, and therefore you basically just have to listen to us um, and listen to revelation and listen to all of this without any sort of way to assess it externally. You can only deal with the internal aspects of things, internally defined. Um, the German conservative revolution that led to Nazism and Bolshevism are actually quite uh, entwined like this. Um, I think we've talked about this on other programs, and I don't want to discuss it here. But essentially, all of these pre Bolshevik philosophers are Kantians, despite and nihilists at times. And they go back and forth between nihilism, Kantianism, the ideas of Martinism that are promoted by Joseph the Maestro, and the return to orthodoxy as well. There's people around Berdyaev and others. Uh, and all this stuff is coming on them at once because Russia didn't really have any sort of intellectual tradition until the Enlightenment. And so you find that a lot of these individuals are so confused in pre Bolshevik Russia that they can simultaneously hold Kantian ideas, simultaneously hold nihilist ideas, and then be seeing a Orthodox spiritual advisor at the same time, and simultaneously hold socialist ideas too, because they view humanism as a threat. Um, so let's go on. And so might Heine have continued in reference to our present day dilemma. I find you stumbling around in the dark, your mouth dropping open with astonishment every time you bump into something, displaying the same craven awe of the practical good as the theoretical evil. Hegel superseded God with man, then with the state. Today, his pupils, the preachers of the dialectic of enlightenment, Theodor Adorno, Max Horkheimer, and their Frankfurt School, supersede man and state with nature. Of course, there can be no more talk of God. Uh, and yeah, they will not rest until man has disappeared from the earth, as the old Hegelians would find no more peace until the realm of divinity lay in rubble, and then the state came forth as the new God. And you have to think of this in the concept of the imperium and Caesaropapism. Um, well, they don't like Caesaropapism. The imperium is basically the same thing. Um, they're both bad ideas. They come from this kind of idea that the state is God, that the state should be God. Integralism is also part of this erroneous proposition. When anyone espouses nature, you Germans see nothing but good in him, and if the devil himself comes clad in high office or distinguished reputation, you say, well, of course, it's the devil, but he has his points, and he's accomplished something in his life, so let's not condemn him just because he's the devil. The Pied Pipers of the Kant-Hegel tradition, however, couldn't play this particular tune more than once if they wanted to seduce you into a philosophical revolution. Therefore, the Neo-Hegelians no longer say that it is the state which is all important, but the individual who rejects the authority of the state. This rejection proceeds joyfully among Poles and Italians. They tend to sing while they sin. But the Germans undertake their extreme individualism in dead earnest. The lone individual individualizes himself to the at which, strictly upholding the Hegelian dialectics, he dissolves and disappears. In the same deadly spirit, it's obvious that all the other individuals must disappear too. Thus do the Germans endeavor to give philosophical justification for sin, unless the philosophical devil is rendered his posthumous due. Nietzsche, Heidegger, Hegel, even our worthy Friedrich Schiller, all thrown in the same pot. And the Germans, after finally turning themselves into sophisticated gourmets, as soon as they enter the realm of the intellect, they swill down a foul, watery mess and announce, it's only ideas. When it comes to my behavior, mind you, I'm V A und J rational. Excuse me. What was that about lightning that comes before the thunder? May we Germans become smarter than we were 150 years ago and truly take Hein's words to heart. Kant's influence on German intellectual life is a well excavated topic. George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel has exerted a still deadlier effect on the history of politics the past 200 years, and so we will wish to render satisfaction to Hein by tracking down the causal links of that Hegelian thunder and lightning. This is kind of a long article. Hegel, this article, if you want to look it up, it's called Time to Bury the Rotten Legacy of George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, and it's by Frank Hahn. Um, there's a lot of good points. The points on Plato we'll go to first, just to get to the point. Um, Objective spirit replaces theology. And this is kind of so we skipped over a part which discusses all the Nazi, anarchist Hegelian, the Russian Hegelians. All of this stuff is important, but we're talking about Plato, and I want to stay focused on Plato. So we're talking about absolute divine simplicity. As well as Dyer's epistemology. I'm just trying to find this freaking thing because PDF viewer is being stupid. But you can see it. The Habsburg connection here, there's actually a Martinist connection where Hegel stays within the circles of a bunch of Martinist aristocrats. Come on. I just freaking saw it. It starts with, in Hegel's belief and understanding, in belief and knowledge, Hegel went so far as to characterize Christianity as a sect. The disciples' coercive ties to the person of Jesus could justify sins and crimes in his name. Then follows the usual attack against the church for exploiting Christianity as an instrument of domination. What dimly sputters here is the fanaticism of many of Hegel's German contemporaries who threw out the baby of the bathwater in rational theology. They threw out the church. That the church often played a dubious political role over the centuries is a truism. What draws Hegel and his students to battle under the post-Enlightenment banner is, however, the concept of filioque, that the Holy Spirit proceeds not only from the Father but also from the Son. So, two things that Hegel attacks, or two views that Hegel has that was extremely influential on Berdyaev and all those ROCOR, Emerget, and whatever, is these Hegelian concepts against filioque and the Hegelian concept of Plato, and we're going to get to these right now. What is the decisive message of Christianity, if not the person of Jesus Christ, who became at once God and man? Became is a bad word, but who was at once God and man. This message, through which the immortal individual can participate in the divine, imago vivo Dei, has endowed human beings with freedom, true freedom, from the arbitrary laws and caprices of a perverse oligarchy. Law instead becomes implanted with men. We are free because within us we can recognize the image of God if we consciously and increasingly use our creative power, or power of reason. We cannot push aside the great questions of our age and delegate them to others. There are no longer any excuses. Each person is individually obligated to intervene in the great apparatus of what we call history, the world, the universe, not arbitrarily, but in accordance with creative law and God's law dwelling within us. Hegel, like Rousseau before him, finds this impossible. The mere weak mortal cannot aspire to be a son of God, and therefore something out of the ordinary. There is an exception, Hegel himself. He was to become what was called the objective spirit personified. In him, the entire development of philosophy reached its consummation. No further progress could occur. Unfortunately, not only the master embraces this immodest claim, but his epigones as well. For Hegel, previous world history was characterized by pain over the death of God, and thus by ongoing suffering. In a speculative Good Friday, suffering comes to rest because the acknowledgement that God is dead leads to man's liberation. So you have Christianity in the first stage, and then nihilism in the second. Christianity is dissolved in philosophy. Man turns himself into God as he accepts objective spirit into himself. Hegel carried out this enterprise, intoxicating himself with the personal experience of the Logos. In his very own self, he beheld the distinction canceled between God and man, and that is how he enumerates his four epochs of world history: God the Father, God the Son, the Holy Spirit, and Hegel. High point of world history at which man finally becomes redeemed. Hegel's dialectic, all is one. Now here's the Platonic part. This exceedingly pathological variant of Gnosticism was dressed up in Hegel's pretentious dialectic, which is a frontal attack on two of Europe's greatest thinkers, Plato and Leibniz. Hegel banalized Plato, especially the Parmenides dialogue, in his lectures on Plato. Hegel states, Plato's expression is the other is the same, is the self-identical, the other, which is not self-identical, is also the same. The result of this dialectic in Parmenides is now the one is not and is not. It is itself at the same time as it is the other ideas, and becoming is being and non-being. The reality of both is becoming. Now this is nonsense, so don't if you don't understand this, it's okay. If you read the Parmenides carefully, you will find that Plato wanted to express precisely the opposite. The historical Parmenides was the founder of the Eleatic school, whose views Plato combated. How could one attribute the words Plato put into Parmenides' mouth to Plato himself? What occurs during the dialogue is that Plato subjects Parmenides' thinking to the most effective conceivable reductio ad absurdum. Hegel, however, takes at face value the ludicrous final inference by Parmenides, namely that the one is and is not at all encompassing is the many, and both are the all encompassing, and so on and so forth. Hegel praised the Parmenides as a towering example of the pre modern skepticism in order to make it the foundation of his own system. Yet in this very dialogue, Plato clearly works out the ontological distinction between being and becoming. Hegel fuzzes over precisely the fundamental distinction and falls back below the level of pre Socratics. Indeed, Hegel's version of the dialectics eliminates more than 2,000 years of philosophical investigation, a deadly accomplishment as we shall see. This is how Hegel devised the peculiar concepts of being and becoming. Pure being is fully abstract and indeterminate. Since therefore nothing can be said about being, it is identical with nothingness. Here the gate opens for Nietzsche and the nihilists, but this is clearly self-contradictory. Now, if you look at Father Seraphim Rose's nihilism, if you look at the criticisms of absolute divine simplicity by Dyer, this is the same fundamental idea. Is this indistinction between being and becoming? Is this misunderstanding of Parmenides? Um, and they basically posit that the Catholic Church absolute divine simplicity opens the door for atheism and Nietzscheanism. It's the same argument, maybe with different sprinklings on top, maybe with some quote minds, or even the erroneous assumptions of some church fathers, but they're identical. Now comes the real cruncher. Being is incessant unrest, says Hegel, which sinking down collapses to a point of final stasis. This collapses signifies that being and nothingness disappear, and then becoming disappears too. Now we can drop the curtain. Philosophical speculation has brought itself to the point of absurdity. Hegel invokes the infinite, but this process of destruction amounts to a mere affirmation of entropy and finitude. To overcome this dilemma, Hegel introduces the negation of negation. Finitude negated yields infinity, which in turn negated reverts to finitude, and so on and so forth. Whatever material or intellectual substance may actually exist finds its identity only through being turned into its opposite. with a return ticket naturally, since the fare includes an eventual switch back into the opposite of the opposite. Of course, all this remains a pure contrast, providing no scientific elucidation of any phenomena. The devastating effects on science, political thought, and morality are evident. Every pair of contradictions will be driven beyond itself by the dialectic into somehow becoming identical: death and life, hell and heaven, beast and man, evil and good. And the eternal indifferent sameness, which Hegel dubs the absolute idea or eternal progression, we reach a condition which Hegel himself ridiculed in his attack on Joseph Schelling: a night in which all cats are gray, a night which decomposes any principle of moral direction. At my next step, I can do evil and call evil good. It makes no difference, because in any case, the one will soon turn itself into the other. And this is a kind of process, I think, that is behind a lot of brainwashing. Is first you attack the issue of reason, and once reason's gone, whatever the theology is, whatever the tradition of the cult is, you could brainwash people to essentially believe that evil is good and good is evil. But this is on a mass scale, and on a mass scale of both the German population and the Russian population. Recall the present day debate over economic notion of creative destruction of Schumpeter has haunted the world with the motto, "Be happy when we shut down half your production and lay off millions of people." All this guaranteed to translate sooner or later into a recovery. This school of thought was called dialectical materialism by Karl Marx. Today, the ideologues of the free market economy call it pragmatism, and the instigator of this dialectic is called an idealist. The idealism of the infinite sameness leads directly to materialism, because the matter can no longer be differentiated from mind or spirit. Hegelianism casts discredit on the actual idealists who conceive of a higher infinite form of existence, transcending the temporal. Their idea of the infinite did not lead into the chaos of pure nothingness. Already in the thought of Plato, as we have indicated, infinite becoming finds its limit in infinite being. Cusa says that the absolute, as the absolute infinite or God, envelops or limits the relative infinite, the human species. And thus we have two distinct kinds of infinite. Limit, in this case, does not impose a new finitude, but defines the absolute infinite as an ordering principle with respect to the relative infinite between God and man. Progress thus has a direction instead of the endless up and down. There exists a measurable development. And the endless up and down is just like the eternal return. It's just like um, Joseph de Maistre. It's just like Polybius' cycle of government. The concept of having progressives and reactionaries in society. Nobody should name themselves this, because they're both based on this up and down. These are bad labels. In his monadology, Leibniz had forcefully spelled this out. Monads are the primary substance. They are little infinities. The entire universe reflects itself in each monad at any given time in an individual way. Human souls belong to the sphere of monads. They receive only from God and also act upon the outside world. Their creativity, through which they effect changes in the universe, finds its limit and thus its ordering principle in the highest monad, God. Through our relationship with God, the chain of creative acts has an ordering, and in itself concludes to a higher ordering of the whole. Leibniz says very beautifully, scientist must first discover himself in God. The law of creation is within us. In Leibniz, the creative act is a being or substance which newly determines becoming and leads to the higher state of being. It produces tangible progress by means of dedicated effort. In Hegel, being and becoming devolve alike into nothingness. But since in Hegel's consistent dialectic something new has to emerge, the pure negation loses its terrifying quality, and here is where left Hegelianism comes in. While Hegel still speaks of superseding and elevating, his left wing epigones are already looking to annihilate. Politically, the intent is to tear down the bourgeoisie order, epistemologically, to destroy metaphysics. The left Hegelians deny man any relationship to the non-sensuous reality and seek to cast him back down to the level of raw sensuous ego or I. The pathway for these efforts was paved by Hegel's dissolution of the Christian religion in his essentially nihilistic dialectic. And so this leftist Hegelian and the right wing Hegelian dissolution into the I is kind of the basis for the incredibly alienating Christian existentialism and just regular existentialism of Heidegger, of Maritain, of Berdyaev. They go on to influence a lot of the traditionalists, whether they're Catholics or Orthodox. I mean, this is a great article, but you might get the point already. So we'll go on. S90's making a lot of good points here. Yeah, John, the Cathars, Albigensians, Bogomils, all the same. Um, yeah, Dugan and E. Michael Jones and all these people misinterpret logos. Um, Dugan, first of all, is Orthodox. He's an old believer, which means he's just obsessed with traditional, traditionalist superstition, denial of reason, denial of science. He also came to Orthodoxy through uh, Julius Evola and Rene Guénon and Gurdjieff, just as Seraphim Rose did. And Jay Dyer also admits you can look at all the video. There's a documentary by, I wouldn't recommend them for anything else, but the Diamond Brothers at VaticanCatholic.com. You could see Jay Dyer admits he changed his religion like 7 times or something. And he first was an Orthodox after he converted from SSPX Catholicism and seat of vacantism. He becomes Orthodox and then he loses his faith and he starts reading the traditionalist authors, Guénon and others. And then he comes back to Orthodoxy. It is through that pathway that he now is espousing the Neo-Orthodox Russian idea, uh, the ROCOR position that comes from this Berdyaev Salon in St. Petersburg. Um, moving on. We'll talk later about Dugan's being in the world and all of this as it relates to Hegelianism and Kantianism. Let me see if I have any other good quotes. Any quote mines here? But you have to think of the Russian Orthodox cult of peasantry, of the lumpen proletariat, how it is related to Marxism and then the right wing of Marxism under Bakunin. Yeah, here's the Martinist links for Hegel. Hegel established ties with the North German and Danish network, best viewed as an extension of Anglo-Dutch Venetian interests. At its core was grouping around Princess Gallitzin, uh, which included Count von Reventlow of Holstein, the former Danish ambassador of London. In its agitation for prerogatives of nobility, the illustrious Reventlow Gallitzin circle made use of theosophy in the garb of mystical Catholicism, and the mysticism was wielded against the rational theology of Leibniz and Gotthold Ephraim Lessig. One thing about theosophy is that Berdyaev and Soliev, and I think Bulgakov, who are these major white Russians that basically produce the entirety of the ROCOR theologians, Losky and these individuals, refer to themselves as Christian theosophists, and they actually were also sophiologists who believe that they should introduce Sophiology or Sophia as a fourth person of the Trinity. And this is directly tied to the Catholic mysticism um, of Claude Saint Martin and the Martionists. Okay. Yeah, let's go on. Next on the agenda. So we have the false Hegelian interpretations. Um, but here is where Jay Dyer uses the false translations by Benjamin Jowett of Plato. And we have proof of this because in several of his articles he cites Benjamin Jowett's translations. And like we said before, I mean, Jowett will replace the word logos, which means reason, word, whatever, with tail. Especially, you can look at anybody who delves into it, Atlantis studies um, and studies Plato's Atlantis. You can see they don't like Jowett because he misinterprets a ton of things and actually misleads people. But Jowett was one of these racist, New Dark Ages, anti-Raphael, anti-Renaissance individuals around John Ruskin. I remember John Ruskin is the founder of the New Liberalism in England that produces 19th century England that produces Chesterton and the English Catholic traditionalists, and then the Fabian socialists as well. All look up to Ruskin. But Alchemy and John Donne and Ben Jonson, we see that Jay Dyer cites Timaeus of Benjamin Jowett and other articles as well. Just one example there. Uh, why is this here? So Dyer, this is how Dyer interprets Plato. For Plato, absolute simplicity could not allow for any real distinctions, changes, or relations, as that would negate his prior assumption of all distinctions entailing dialectical tensions. Athens versus Jerusalem. The first millennium of the church was henceforth busy refuting Hellenism in this very point at every single council. At Celsus, Origen, Arius, Eunomius, Plotinus, Nestorius, and all the other heretics were quite literally operating on the Hellenic presuppositions and not Hebraic revelation. Naturally, the Roman Catholic may try to say St. Basil is wrong and the later dogma is right. In response, they need to grasp, as we will see below, the essence energy distinction is bound up with not just triadology, but correct Christology. The basic assumption here is wrong, though. He says, for Plato, absolute simplicity could not allow for any real distinctions, changes, or relations, as that would negate his prior assumption of all distinctions entailing dialectical tensions. We realize this is the same argument by Hegel that it eventually leads into its own negation. This is the same argument of Proculus. Um, and so Jay Dyer is already starting on this false fundamental level, which doesn't actually start with the church fathers, but a reinterpretation of this neo-Orthodox circles around the Russian transplantation of the French Enlightenment to Russia. Um, Proof that the translations are false. Here's one of these Atlantean scholars. I can give you examples from Plato's Timaeus and Critias where the Atlantis story is told. And this is specifically referring to Benjamin Jowett, and we'll get into what Jowett was part of later on. Each translator translates according to his interpretation of the Atlantis story. The widespread translation by Benjamin Jowett, for example, translates logos with tail in order to make it more plausible that the Atlantis story is just a tale. But logos is never a tale. Mostly, it means a reliable and true story, a reasonable story, a word. Uh, it can be a neutral story too, but not tale. Another importantly translatory problem is passage in the middle of, where it is not said in the middle of what? Literally, it is the middle of the island, but the most translators translate it in the middle of the coastal line. But this is an important thing, whether its place is at the sea coast or within the island inner land, and so on, and so on. Yes, if you are not able to read Greek, you should really try to read as many translations as you can and ask an expert if you feel that there is a problem. Um, there's other problems where, um, see if I saved it. Energy is um, versus power with the Greek word dynamis. Um, Power is a much stronger term, but translators will say Plato doesn't mean power. If you think of something like number powers or something like this, dynamis is translated as something else. Let me see if I can find that because that's actually a really good point. Um, Energy. This is called Power versus Energy, the Difference. And the translators will actually say in the footnotes, oh, how inappropriate of a term for Plato to use this. The other thing you have to realize, despite the fact that that's literally what the word means, um, another thing you have to realize is that every single English translator bases his translation and also the lexicon used to translate off of Benjamin Jowett. So most of the translations are wrong. Um, to a rough first approximation, uh, the Greek dynamis might be rendered in its broad usage variously as ability, potential, potency, power, whereas energeia corresponds roughly to activity, and in Aristotle, especially to actuality, in the sense of actively existing. Plato's dialogues demonstrate, however, that Plato and his circles possessed a precise and highly developed scientific conception of dynamis, having no direct equivalent in today's degenerated modern language use. Perhaps the best illustration of that degeneration and its causes is the freak out virtually by every modern translator at the implication of the celebrated passage in Plato's uh, Theaetetus, to which LaRouche is often referred. It is there that the young Theaetetus recounts to Socrates preliminary discovery concerning the nature of powers connected with the doubling, tripling, etc. of a square, and which lie beyond the domain of simple linear magnitudes. Rejecting the implication of Plato's actual term, dynamis, modern translators typically try to bring the passage into conformity with the academic correctness of textbook mathematics, using root or surd in place of power, and apologizing in the footnotes for the supposed inappropriateness of Plato's choice of language. Um, so here is a little bit about Benjamin Jowett. Remember, he's a romanticist. He is anti-reason, and he's part of this Jesuit Oxford Balliol College group that spawns the New Liberals. And he's around this guy named Arthur Evans, as well as John Ruskin. And we'll read about Arthur Evans here and Jowett's role in Evans' operation. Arthur Evans was born in 1851 to a middle class businessman father who had picked up by British Royal Society circles and groomed as a promising lackey in the relatively new field of archaeology. Remember that it's British archaeology, also a Freemasonic archaeological military group that Lord Kitchener was part of, that created the premise for Israeli Palestine. Into the Kitchener Papers, this archaeology was actually used to sneak Jews into Palestine to start the population of it. Um, the young Evans was raised on a diet of Darwin, Huxley, and Aryan racial superiority. As MacGillivray reports, Evans came to Oxford just as the Aryans marched from myth into history, and he was as proud as any other to proclaim his connection to them. Evans' racism was unabashed. He wrote in 1875 that I believe in the existence of inferior races and would like to see them exterminated. He became the son-in-law of the racist historian Edward Friedman, who once publicly expressed the wish that every Irishman would murder a black person and then be hanged for the greater good of the Germanic race. His marriage to Margaret Friedman, who shared the racist views of her father and new husband, was one of convenience since Evans was a homosexual whose sexual orientation became public towards the end of life. That's another key component to the Ruskin Group pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood is their penchant for pederasty and homosexuality, which is partially where you get this Greek Platonic myth of prominent homosexuality among the Academy of Plato, which we've shown he already rejects as being dangerous to society. Evans just barely graduated from Oxford thanks to the intervention of his father and Friedman. His first assignment was an intelligence agent deployed under the government of Prime Minister William Gladstone. Not yet 20 years old, Evans was arrested by the French as a spy in Paris in 1870 during the Franco-Prussian War, then arrested by Austrians in 1875 in Zagreb during an insurrection against the Ottoman rulers, finally arrested in the Balkans in 1882. It was time to redeploy Evans, and his new assignment was to destroy the work of Heinrich Schliemann and replace him as a preeminent archaeologist on Bronze Age Mediterranean cultures. Schliemann, a German businessman, was a lifelong lover of Homer's epics, who became convinced that Troy and Mycenae were not fictional locations but grounded in history. He devoted his life to proving this discovery and excavating first Troy and then Mycenae. Evans was introduced to Schliemann in 1883 in Athens. And in 1884, he was given the necessary credentials for his new career and was appointed to head of Oxford's Ashmolean Museum. During this period, the British through Oxford were running an inside-outside operation against the influence of Greek classics in education. Benjamin Jowett, represented the pro-classical side, was deployed to translate Plato's dialogue so as to beat the ideas out of them and render Plato as an ancient Newtonian. Jowett's crime continues to this day, by the preponderance of his translations and modern editions. Evans was groomed to cover the other side, attacking the excess reliance on the study of Greek classics and then sabotaging the study of the origin of Greek culture. So, a Newtonian Plato would basically be this idea by Proculus and Hegel. It would basically be this idea of scientific deism of the clockmaker rather than this idea of deism extended from Leibniz of the best of all possible worlds. The idea that secular culture must believe in God, despite the fact that individuals within society should tend towards religion. Um, the Schliemann was diverted from traveling to Crete in 1883 and in 1885 in order to be honored by the British Royal Society and Queen Victoria herself. Could not have been coincidental. Eventually traveling to Crete in 1886 and 1889, he was never able to obtain excavation rights and died in Italy in 1890. On his way back to Crete, Greece and Crete. The possibility that his enemies orchestrated his demise should not be overlooked. Evans arrived at Crete in 1893 and had spent the next 4 decades creating a Minoan civilization in the image dictated by his controller's perverted worldview. Crete, as mysterious related, relatively advanced autochthonous society, which gave rise to Mycenaean civilization, and from it classical Greece. Evans deliberately ignored, obscured, and even destroyed evidence that Crete and Mycenae were outposts of Egyptian colonization and science. They wanted to destroy any idea that reason makes civilization possible under a natural theology that then is supplemented with the choice of redemption through the coming of Christ. But that's where Jowett fits in, is this romanticist pro-Dark Ages, pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. And hence, all of his translations, which are later used by everybody else as a lexicon, are colored that way. Now, here's an introduction to Jowett's errors. It's in the introduction to the LaRouche movement's translation of Timaeus in February 1980 in Campaigner magazine. let's see how long we've been going for. Uh, only an hour and a half. It's felt longer than that. So the CNP oriented people coming out of the neoconservative revolution, neoconservatives used them as part of their Southern strategy. They also used Plato uh, through Allan Bloom, who translated Plato, and there's some good nuggets in a later article that we're going to read concerning this. Okay, this is intense indeed. Somebody said that they're going to go to confession after this video, but it will be kind of hard because this is a long video. But please like and subscribe. Um, every single like gives me 15 more minutes of not passing out due to my lack of food. Your likes giving me power. I run off of a feeding tube that's connected to how many likes I get, and I will die in the middle of this video if you don't give me likes. So let's go on. There's also, like I said, the Jesuit connection to this obscuring of Plato. I don't want to read this entire thing, but this also discusses the connection between Bernard of Clairvaux and this irrationalist doctrine. Oh my goodness. I'm trying to find the best place to start. Mm. Okay. Well, here, we'll talk about the Delphi principle. And that should lead into it because the parts about Jowett are down below. The essential methods for cult manufacture in this way are sometimes identified currently as the Delphi principle. These are the methods which the authors of the writings attributed to Aristotle employed in their efforts to simultaneously co-opt and destroy Platonic knowledge, just as the apostles and patristics used methods paralleling Plato's to defend Christianity against the pseudo-Christian cults. So the methods of Plato's adversary Aristotle were used as a fundamental body of method and procedure for designing pseudo-Christian cults. The significance of Aristotle in this respect is summarily the following. He was a member of the established oligarchist family and an agent of the cult of the Apollo at Delphi from not later than his apprenticeship as an intelligence operative, Macedonian Persian spy for the cult at Isocrates' Athenian School of Rhetoric. This is why Jay Dyer is obsessed with rhetoric and debate. This isn't why he's upset, but I mean, Jay Dyer is obsessed with rhetoric and debate, uh, mainly because he has this kind of worldview. Um, it's academic. It's not something that is looking into how can I, the individual, how can man look into these issues and in accordance with our own reason, find coherency and find proofs. He's really just somebody who promotes this kind of false form of traditionalism. Uh, going Although the Babylonian priesthood in particular had perfected methods of cult. Well, and one more thing about that is that Gregory Palamas and all of these, after the closure of the School of Athens by the Imperium, I think under Julian, um, the philosopher that was still allowed in the East was Aristotle, and that most of the major um, theologians had to write a thesis works on Aristotle in order to be accepted as um, as Orthodox theological leaders. Although the Babylonian priesthood, in particular, had perfected methods of cult syncretization as a psychological science, over the centuries, the concentration of scientific knowledge embodied in Plato's Academy at Athens represented for Delphi and Babylon the most deadly potential danger to the oligarchical faction had faced. Plato's consolidation and advancement of Greek science represented a new quality of foe. Just as an entire civilized world depended on Greek methods of warfare for nations whose military policies was not totally suicidal, so the Babylonians depended upon the Greek agents of Delphi. Most notably, the Peripatetics led by Aristotle to apply ancient cult methods to the task of attempting to neutralize the more powerful quality of knowledge represented by Plato's Academy. Aristotle, after his own initial training under Isocrates, was assigned to penetrate the Academy and remain there for an extended period as a Delphi penetration agent in a Persian spy. Now, this is a lot of speculative stuff. I don't necessarily like it, um, but just go with it. There are some factual claims made in here that are important. By developing the ancient cult syncretization methods of the oligarchical priesthood into a weapon adapted to cultist practices against Platonism, the oligarchists brought their cult synchronization methods to a relatively highest degree of development. In principle, from the period down into Oxford University and the Ashmolean Museum or Tavistock Institute of today, the British monarchy and its predecessors have effected no principled advances in cultist methods of psychological warfare over the methods associated with the peripatetic subgroup of the cult of Apollo. It should be interpolated here out of courtesy to our Soviet discussion partners that in the matter of Neoplatonism, the advantage relative to Moscow is not entirely on the side of today's Catholic Church. There are three most commonly recurring sticking points in the tradition of the Catholic Church's post-patristic history, which Catholic leaders of the apostolic tradition have attempted to circumvent, but have not so far mustered the courage and insight to expatriate directly. Aristotle and Aristotelian methods are the common denominator of this problem. Three sticking points, which correlate with every other expression of the same difficulty, are the seizure of the control of the papacy by the Pier Leone converted Jewish bankers of Rome during the 11th century, Bernard of Clairvault's doctrine of cultist irrationalism against Abelard of Paris. And Abelard wasn't right on everything, but you can't be a zealot. Being a zealot is a bad thing. Being a zealot is the only thing you can really refer to as the Jewish revolutionary spirit. I know E. Michael Jones tries to make every single thing that ever happened in history part of the Jewish revolutionary spirit, but zealotry is the thing that you can truly call the Jewish revolutionary spirit, um, the movement of the zealots. During the 12th century, in the case of Thomas Aquinas of the 13th century against Roger Bacon. St. Thomas Aquinas was actually deployed. This article is kind of dumb in that respect. And the LaRouche movement grew out of this when they founded the Schiller Institute and worked more closely with the Catholic Church. But Aquinas was actually answering to the Avarists, and he was trying to synchronize or syncretize or be an apologist and say what you can and can't accept from the Aristotelian doctrine, because the Avarists were, pure Aristotelians, and they believed everything that Aristotle taught. And Aquinas was there and published the Summa in order to interpret through the Platonic tradition of Saint Augustine um, reasons against the Avarist heresy, which was based on Aristotle. But it is not considered to be some sort of all-encompassing system of dogmatic theology that some people have made it within the church to be. But going on, the Catholic leaders of the apostolic tradition circumvent the difficulties associated with Aquinas' commentaries on Aristotle essentially by defining Aquinas as an Augustinian who commented upon Aristotle rather than a radical pagan view of Aristotle adopted by the Anglican Jesuits of today, which defines Aquinas as an Aristotelian. By defining Aquinas as an Augustinian, which has an emphatic historical basis in Aquinas' repudiation of his earlier work towards the close of his life, the apostolic traditionalists concerned to save Aquinas' position argue essentially as follows. They argue that Neoplatonism is essential to the comprehension of all essential matters, but that the Aristotelian method is useful for order concerns. The analogy in Soviet practice in the case in which of influence and Bukharin were established to be rehabilitated as the British demand today. The effort to falsify Soviet history in such a way as to allow some merit to the enemies and Bukharin and G. Ryazanov would provide a most useful cover for deployment of all sorts of British Zionist penetration agents and relatively high levels of the Soviet party in the state. Now, I don't believe in that analogy. I think that's pretty stupid. Um, Obviously, I believe in what I just said and not in what's posited here. It may be the case that V.I. Lenin tolerated the wretched Bukharin just as he tolerated the wretched Karl Radek. If one knows the facts, what an agglomeration of variously outright agents and muddleheads even the Bolshevik leadership of 1917 represented, one better appreciates the magnitude of Lenin's role during that and the following years, and also the virtually impossibility of cleansing the Bolshevik leadership of all the figures who had dirty pedigrees as agents of various police and other intelligence services in their past. Now, this is still during the infantile LaRouche movement stage when they were Leninists. Um, it's questionable what LaRouche was doing. He says that he was sent in by the FBI to basically pull out any sort of positive forces out of the socialist um, student for democratic society, the Boomerwaffen of the left, and later on they reject all of these points. They learn and teach that Lenin was an agent sent in by General Ludendorff into Russia to cause a revolution, and Ludendorff is one of the guys that's with Hitler at the beer hall Pusht, and later on was the agent of Fritz Thyssen. If you ever heard of Fritz Thyssen's funding of the Nazi Party, one of the major anti-Jewish guys, uh, one of the defenders of Kitchener, I believe. Uh, so I think the LaRouche movement kind of got away from this once they realized the facts about history. The same Aristotelian method is manifest in controlling Delphi principle and the deliberate falsification of translations of Plato by Oxford and Cambridge specialists down to the present day. The case of Benjamin Jowett is illustrative of translators who apparently used every opportunity to mistranslate specific terms, for example, the Timaeus, in such a way as to mystify clear argument through superimposition of Anglican religious terminology. In each of the pseudo-Christian cults, the Delphi principle is key. The first a large-scale pseudo-Christian cult problem centered around Gnosticism. Gnosticism overall attempted to adapt Christianity to the form authorized Roman Empire pantheon, describing Christianity as analogous to the inner beliefs of the cult of Isis as a mystery religion. More crucial in this package were the alternative versions of monophysitism, the one arguing that Christ was merely of moral nature, or the opposing monophysite doctrine that Christ had no mortal nature. Uh, From the vantage point of the Timaeus, the practical implications of the various monophysite dogmas quickly become clear. The consubstantiality of the divine and mortal for the doctrine of the imitation of Christ is seen as crucial. All right, I'll be back. I got to go to the bathroom. Uh, take a break to go downvote Jay Dyer, and I'm just kidding. Take a break, pat yourself on the back, try to gather your notes. I don't know. I'll be right back. Make sure you like and subscribe, or I won't be back. And if you have a Twitter or whatever, post this on Twitter um, with an @Jay Dyer or something. I don't know. I don't know. I really don't care. I'll be right back. All right. And we're back. Um, I'm back. Yeah, this is recorded on a soundstage. We turned the lights up too high. That's why it's so sunny here. Um, so a lot of this article is explaining Christianity to a bunch of Leninists. I doubt that it's a bunch of Leninists watching this, unless if they're Jay Dyer, friends of Jay Dyer. So okay, going directly to the point we introduced at the outset, Plato's writings show us that there has been virtually no progress and much retrogression in respect to fundamental features of Platonic science, but there has been much development from the archaic level of particularized aspects of Attic Greek knowledge and practice. To restate the point, with some distinguishable exceptions, there has been no significant advancement in the general knowledge of the higher hypothesis, which is talked about in Timaeus. There had been successive qualitative advancements in the knowledge of the lower orders of hypothesis. This is the general empirical fact of the past 23 centuries of human history. Any history which does not begin with empirical fact, which does not adequately comprehend the crucial fact and its implications, is axiomatically an incompetent historiography. First, we must settle accounts with the lack of the significant progress and the lack of the notion of higher hypothesis. Is the lack of advancement on this matter of reflection of some necessary principle? Is the principle connected to the presumption that Plato and the Neoplatonists might have approximated a perfected notion of the higher hypothesis such that very little progress further was available? Or is it the lack of development of the higher hypothesis notion over the age a result of some perfect defect in the progress of mankind in that period, i.e., the Dark Ages? We understand. I don't want to go through all this LaRouche stuff, man. Let's get to Jowett. I know he's down here. Oh my goodness. That's a completely separate section. Okay, so here's the translator's preface. This is actually going to tell us about Benjamin Jowett a little bit more in depth. And we don't have much to go on the video, just some stuff about, because we already show that the absolute divine simplicity based on Plato's chain of being argument isn't even Plato's chain of being argument, and that the actual argument is something akin to, but not the same as the Lutheran reformer Leibniz arguments. Um, we've already proven that Jay Dyer lies or just doesn't know what he's talking about is based off of these fictitious, falsified. Um, and I'm trying to be obtuse here. That's Jay Dyer's favorite word that doesn't exist. I'm trying to be clear here. Falsified translations of Timaeus and Parmenides. This new translation of Plato's Timaeus into English does not claim to be the ideal perfect translation of history-making ancient text. We are confident that in future, much better translations will be produced and made available to the English-speaking public. This translation, however, is the best English language translation of Plato's scientific treatise to date. In point of the fact that the International Caucus Labor Committee decided to launch its own translation project of the Plato text because of the frauds, inaccuracy, and outright fabrications which dominate all of existing translations. A more detailed treatment of the problem with English language translations of Plato's work will be offered in the forthcoming book edition of this translation. And I'll tell you right now that the English language lacks a certain kind of um, mode that other languages very easily have. I forget what it's called at the moment. It has to do with describing transitive things. Um, Plato or Shakespeare was very famous um, for using this in his plays, and it's actually one of the reasons why we know that Shakespeare was not Francis Bacon or any of these other idiots that they say, because these people didn't use this mode. Um, but I can't remember what it is, and maybe I'll post it in the bottom. I'll just say, well, this is what I was talking about after the after the show. What can be somewhat rarely stated in the brief preface is that the three dominant English language translations of Timaeus, whose of Jowett, Conford, and Taylor are complete premeditated frauds commissioned by British intelligence, which has dominated the Oxford Cambridge deployment since the time of Clarendon, to state the case conservatively. Each of the three rival translations conflicts with the other two, and each was undertaken to establish a different kind of slander at Plato's expense. Jowett, who takes extreme liberties with the Greek text, attempts to conjure a nebulous potarstrish effect in order to support the claim that Plato was some sort of myth maker and poetical dreamer, essentially not concerned with fundamental issues of scientific method, especially in the particular dialogue. Hornford, Hornford, though he makes a more passable attempt at obfuscating the epistemological integrity of the dialogue, commits a fraud in his translating efforts, mainly because he systematically distorts those portions of the text in which Plato makes a special effort to convey the sense to the reader that he treats ideas as ontological existences that are endowed with a reality qualitatively superior to the apparent reality usually imputed to things of sense perception or ephemerals. Um, this systematic flaw of Cornford is most dramatically evident in the 52A4 52D section, where his translation turns out to be an arbitrary fabrication conveying a meaning directly opposite to that of the original Greek text. Taylor's translation and commentary, perhaps the most celebrated in recent decades, is probably the most deplorable fraud of all. Taylor translates and comments from the specific task oriented standpoint of disproving the thesis that Timaeus is Plato's thesis on natural science, coherent with Riemannian mathematics, superior to Einstein's formulation of the theory of relativity. Taylor attempts to conceal the most devastating thesis of relativistic phase space that Plato fully develops in Timaeus. Exemplary of the frauds prevailing in all other existing translations of Timaeus, frauds which may be the persistent translation and necessary undertaking, are the cases of such added Greek terms as pantoptapes, which is the manifold, and the celebrated hypodoke, which is host. The first being usually mistranslated as strange variety. So, strange variety and manifold are not uh, commensurable terms, commensurable terms. And the latter atrociously rendered as the nonsensical receptacle. So host receptacle, like a trash bin versus a being which contains something inside, which the fraudulent Jowett incorporated into the official or Oxford Greek dictionary. The greatest fraud, however, is the systematic failure of all previous translators to render the even thoughtful, stimulating narrative style, which is unique in Plato's usage of the dialect. The present translation is only a small step towards the remedy of this problem. For an even better translation, two important ingredients will be required. First, the medium of the English language, as used at the present time, will have to be enriched after it breaks out of its present prevailing nominalist usage. A great deal of inherent richness and versatility of the English language has been buried under the heaps of banality of present day usage. The fate of the English language is not to wither away under the banality of conveying empiricist utilitarian conceptions. Once we free the English speaking world from the ideological grip of British empiricism, we shall have created an English speaking population cheerfully engaged in a socialized practice of thinking socially and of reflecting socially upon their thought processes. Once such dialectical processes are established as social practice, the language itself yields to the power of thought, and the inherent richness of the language comes to the fore as a prized possession of society. Um, so that's it. you could see a little bit more of the falsification there. Then we have, this is a Webster Tarpley article. Webster Tarpley is always fun, um, except when he kicks you out for being a LaRouche movement member, uh, even though you're not, and he was. Uh, so let's see what Plato's Pharmacy of Derrida. Here's a Heideggerian. That's hard to say. So, Christian existentialist and Nazi Party official philosopher Heidegger uses Derrida's, um, which is essential to Alexander Dugan and the Neo-Orthodox philosophy, um, being being in the world and what have you. He uses Plato from Derrida's view. So we have all of these various false interpretations of Plato, and we're continuing to go down the line. Again, following his Nazi guru Heidegger, Derrida focuses his destruction on the metaphysics of presence as this relates to language. The presence amounts to the solid ground for knowledge, certain knowledge for the certitude that something exists. Derrida is at pains to point out that the presence of this kind is required as a precondition for the conceptual apparatus of Western philosophy from the time of the Greeks down. It could be shown that all names related to fundamentals, to principles, or to the center have always designated an invariable presence. Eidos, action; arche, principle or first cause; telos, purpose; energia, visa, essence, existence; substance, subject; aletheia, truth; transcendentality, consciousness, God, man, and so forth. In language is equated with the transcendental signified or ultimate referent, which would function as the ultimate guarantee of meaning. We see that for Derrida, all Western languages are metaphysical, since their key words and concepts are permeated by Christian Platonism. They are also metaphysical, he thinks, because the only way to be sure of meaning of send over a pizza presupposes the Christian Platonic foundations of the whole civilization. Derrida therefore sets out to destroy Platonism by destroying language, while hoping to destroy the civilization along with it. So more Kantians trying to destroy the legacy of Plato. And it has to be understood that the West is based on Platonic tradition, and this is why the Orthodox and the Dark Ages traditionalists are being deployed on the basis of targeting reason, Plato, and all of this. Deconstructing Plato. Derrida exalts writing over the speech, but logocentric, phonocentric Western thinkers refuses to go along with them. Derrida directs his rage at Plato by deconstructing the dialogue Phaedrus. The result is the essay Plato's Pharmacy, which appears in Dissemination. That's the work name. This is classical Derridean obfuscation, playing on the multiple meanings of the Greek word pharmakon, which means poison, remedy, magic potion, or medicine. But the field of meaning are even more complicated. Socrates, at the beginning of the dialogue, recounts the story of the nymph Orytheia, who was playing the nymph Pharmakeia when Orytheia was blown over a cliff by Boreas, the north wind. Pharmakeia was herself associated with the healing fountain. Phaedrus has brought some written texts for Socrates to read, and these are compared to the drug pharmakon, which has lured Socrates to leave Athens in order to meet with him and see the texts. Are these texts a healing drug or poison? Socrates narrates the fable of the Egyptian god Thoth, a Hermes Mercury figure who invented counting, geometry, astronomy, dice, and letters, grammata, for writing. Thoth wants to share all the arts with the people of Egypt, so he goes to Amon Ra, Thamos, and offers them to him. Amun-Ra rejects the letters, explaining that these will weaken memory and make available only the appearance and presumption of knowledge, but not true knowledge. Derrida explodes with rage against Socrates and Plato. He says, one beginning with by repeating without knowing through a myth the definition of writing, repeating without knowing. Once the myth has dealt the first blows, the logos of Socrates will crush the accused. He then proceeds to make an obsessive recounting of the Isis Osiris story. Derrida also makes much of the fact that although Plato includes references to Socrates as pharmakeus, poisoner, medicine man, sorcerer, he does not free associate from pharmakon, pharmakeus to pharmakos, meaning scapegoat. The idea is that Socrates really became a scapegoat at his trial, while Plato is making a scapegoat of the writing. The conclusion is that the pharmakeron is neither the cure nor the poison, neither good nor evil, neither the inside nor outside, neither speech nor writing. Through a hidden pattern of ambiguities, the text, in addition to saying what Plato might have meant, also says that Plato cannot have meant. The dialogue thus deconstructed is hopelessly contradictory and impossible to interpret or construe. Nietzsche had called himself Plato in reverse. Now, here's the critical part of this article. And had railed against Socrates, he who does not write, Derrida, attacks Plato in another interminable book. I can't say these long words because my nose is stuffed. The postcard from Socrates to Freud and beyond. Half of this book is made up of a series of wildly disassociated stream of consciousness letters, much like this YouTube video, that revolve around a postcard Derrida says he found at a Bodleian library at Oxford University. The postcard depicts a miniature from an old manuscript showing Socrates seated at a desk writing with a smaller Plato behind him, appearing to Derrida, dictating authoritarian, masterly, imperious. Upon seeing this, Derrida naturally went wild. I always knew it. It had remained like the negative of a photograph that developed for 25 centuries in me, of course. Hundreds of pages of babbling follow, always returning to Derrida's desire to rewrite the history of the philosophy by securing the greatest possible attention from this. Don't forget that all of this took off from the wish to make this picture the cover of the book, all of it pushed back into the margins, the title, my name, the name of the publisher, and miniaturized I mean in red. And miniaturized I mean in red on Socrates' phallus. Other essays in this book evoke Freud and his comparison of the human psyche to the mystic writing pad as another way of undermining the logos. Derrida is always heavily larded with Freud, who was a Kabbalistic mystic, homosexual, and morphine addict himself. This opens up new possibilities for deconstruction in Plato's pharmacy, discussed above. Derrida exerts himself to show that Plato's notion of logos had strong fatherly and paternal overtones. From here, it is not far that Derrida's idiotic neologism of phallocentrism. Derrida seems to think that his confrere Lacan does not go far enough in liberating himself from phallocentrism. Derrida comments Freud, like his followers, only described the necessity of phallocentrism. It is neither an ancient nor a speculative mistake. It is an enormous old root. Um, This just goes on to how he influences Sartre and all of these people. You're talking about Derrida, so it doesn't make any sense. But Plato's pharmacy, essentially a wrecking ball on the left, just like the traditionalists have their own wrecking ball, and the romanticists have their own wrecking ball. We might read this article in full later on. but for now, I think we're going to leave it. I mean, there's so much good stuff in here, but it's all scattered about. So I need to collect the quotes and quote mine. I need to quote mine a little bit to defend my position. But I will need a giant box of Franzia wine to do so. But after this, we go on to the Chicago School and Allan Bloom, who tried to retranslate Plato. And I would say this is a lot closer to traditionalism because traditionalists and I mean the Neo-Orthodox traditionalists and the Catholic traditionalists who go back to the Oracle of Delphi conception of the papacy and go back to the conservative revolution started by Joseph de Maistre. They share the same roots. I mean, they are the same roots. The neocons almost have virtually no difference from the traditionalists, other than the traditionalists are the ones that fall under the spell of religious social control, and the neocons believe they are above it. And this is essentially their interpretation of Plato. So let's just look into Allan Bloom real quick. They generally used the Republic as a means to justify the Bush administration. Um, ba, 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 ba. Here, I think I found it. Tony Papert. Who article? The Secret Kingdom of Leo Strauss. I still remember, as anyone who read it will remember, closing of the American mind always left a peculiar mental aftertaste. No matter where you happened to close the book in the midst of other matters, Bloom would slip in emphatic, unexpected statements, apparently off the subject, never followed up, but which would stay with you for days afterwards. Now, Bloom is like the neoconservative Lyndon LaRouche, who supposedly was based off the Platonic tradition, but then interprets Plato as this kind of Dionysian individual. But at the same time, he condemns rock music and all of these things. Um, so Bloom would slip in emphatic, unexpected statements, apparently off the subject, never followed up, but which would stay with you for days afterwards, just for that reason. I still remember two of them. Bloom wrote that at Socrates' trial, there were men present who wanted to be acquitted. They were the gentlemen. What did he mean by that word gentleman? I had never heard anybody use it in this context before, but Bloom just drops it in there after one sentence. And if I wasn't clear enough, The Closing of the American Mind was this book that advocated what probably the paleo conservatives who are under the control of the CNP and neocons want, which is like this uh, schooling system based off the great books series of Mortimer Adler and Robert Hutchins, which comes out of Chicago School. They want kind of this Pat Buchanan type um, American republic that's not going to bother with any sort of machinations of the English oligarchy, whatever. Um, they want a kind of new aristocracy in the United States, and ultimately it will lead to helping the neocons because they will just use it, just war theory. They'll use these old world explanations for why they could do whatever they want to do. But Closing of the American Mind was one of these largely followed classical revival books that as this article shows, based on Plato, is selling the same kind of shit, although this is a different kind of shit than Jay Dyer, who's using mistranslations of Plato to attack Plato and absolute divine simplicity. This is using mistranslations of Plato to basically create a false traditionalist conservatism. Uh, so I never heard anybody use gentleman in this context before, but Bloom just let it drop after the one sentence and never picked up the thread again. In another nearby location, he wrote that Socrates was accused of not believing in the gods of the city and inventing other gods. Notice, wrote Bloom, that he never denied the charge, but I remember as I thought that he had denied the charge, and prompted my puzzlement at Bloom's remark, I found the words in Plato's Apology of Socrates where Socrates did deny it. And yet this Bloom was supposed to be the Greek scholar and translator of Plato. Just what was he trying to get at? What did he mean? When I learned that Allan Bloom had been a follower of the late Professor Leo Strauss of the University of Chicago, I decided I had to find out what Strauss had said. My only knowledge of Strauss at this time was that another friend whose mother had taken this course at the New School in New York, where Strauss had taught in 1938 to 1948. She had marveled at his command from the Greek. For the rest, all that she would remember was that he was gray, boring, and very distant. Leo Strauss, born in 1899 to observant Jewish parents in Kirchstein, Germany, in the province of Hesse near Marburg, had lived in the U.S. from 1938 until the death of Annapolis, Maryland in 1973. He had written at least 16 textbooks. Most of them were long and such uninteresting sounding titles as The City of Man or Natural Right and History. I decided I would read Strauss's books Socrates and Aristophanes, both because I was interested in the subject and because I now recalled that Bloom had given me an impression in one of those dark asides of his that Aristophanes' lampoon of Socrates in his play The Clouds had been at least partly truthful, though I knew it to be a lie. Wading into the beginning of Strauss's prefatory material to his Socrates and Aristophanes, it all seemed simple, artless, and totally dull. Aristophanes wrote a play about Socrates. The play, The Clouds, is important, essential, in fact, to the understanding the issues surrounding Socrates, and here it is. Strauss lands us smack into his own translation of the play, a very pedestrian translation with the additional burden of the lengthy stage directions inserted by Strauss, and even directions for what happens off stage, which somehow overwhelm the dialogue. Well and good. At length, having made it through The Clouds, I'm back to Leo Strauss again. As important as this play is, he writes, it cannot be understood apart from its context. 10 other plays of Aristophanes have survived, and here they are. In a dry as dust translations by Strauss, complete with lengthy stage directions, I put the book away, and with it my project to read long books of Leo Strauss. There must be another approach. Now I had a friend with a classics background with whom I was frequently in touch, who had been a leading long-running seminar on Plato's Republic among some of the volunteers for LaRouche, who was himself in prison at the time, having been framed up in a rerun of the Socrates trial at Athens. I learned somehow that my friend, the seminar leader, had studied under the Straussian Stanley Rosen. I had always thought that this Plato seminar was a bit mixed bag. Some parts, which I think stemmed from my friend's own study of the history of Athens, were quite useful. Others were unexpected and eerie, such as, for example, his insistence that Socrates seduced his hearers. But more to the point, an indefinable, ominous sort of quirkiness which overhung every discussion. Eventually it became clear to me that Strauss, through Stanley Rosen, had made the same sort of imprint on my friend, the Strauss's teacher Martin Heidegger, had made upon Strauss himself. In the insightful account of Shadia Drui, nothing made a greater impact on Strauss than Heidegger's manner of studying a text. He was totally struck by Heidegger's analysis of Aristotle's metaphysics. He thought that Heidegger's approach laid bare the intellectual sinews of the text. It was unlikely anything else he had ever seen or heard. Strauss's reaction is not unusual. Heidegger's style of teaching was reputed to have a totally mesmerizing effect. He has been accused of certain mystical bullying. The goal was not so much understanding as initiation into a mystical cult. This is precisely why Karl Jasper's letter to the Denazification Commission advised against Heidegger's returning to the teaching after war. The gist of Jasper's letter was that Heidegger's style was profoundly unfree and that the students were not strong enough to withstand his sorcery. The youth were not safe with Heidegger until they can think for themselves, and Heidegger is no help where that is concerned. On a much smaller scale, the same could be said for Strauss. Kabbalism in Annapolis. We have imprints in LaRouche movement of St. John's College in Annapolis, Maryland, and Santa Fe, New Mexico, with its great books program, another offshoot of the University of Chicago. And this was a program that was implemented by some of the people involved with the education of Henry Kissinger in its primordial stages. And ultimately, it goes back to the uh, physiocrats of the French Revolution's encyclopedia program. I had the chance recently to speak with a relative of one of our members who is, in fact, an evangelist for St. John's, and soon was giving me thumbnail sketches of each of the courses there. When he got to a class on Plato dialogue, he said that the teacher had stayed up all night counting each word in the dialogue so that she could show her class the central word. Word number 25,000 out of 50,000 words, for example. The notion is that the central word in this sense, points to the central idea of the work. And this is the great books program that people like Father Chad Ripperger and others have been duped by. Um, it's completely against the contextual history of any of these things. And it's all about this made up context for this Kantian U-turn and the philosophies that follow after Kant. It sounds just like Strauss, I burst out. Yes, he said. Strauss is influential in the Greek's classic program at St. John's. The influence is probably broader. Already in the 1950s, St. John's in Annapolis had headed for years by Strauss's lifelong friend, Jacob Klein. Strauss retired from Chicago in 1967 and spent a year at Claremont Men's College in California. Then from 1969 until his death in 1973, Strauss was a scholar in resident at St. John's at Annapolis. Now, was it an accident that Strauss's books, especially his later books, were unreadable? No. I came to see that it was deliberate. The purpose was to ensure that the huge majority of readers will tune out after finding nothing but familiar sounding exhortations, such as advice to be moral, patriotic, and God fearing. This is largely how Bloom's Closing of the American Mind was read during its 10 weeks on the bestseller list as a pile of salutary exhortations. The mass of people will find nothing but pablum. But the few intelligent young men, and it's always men or boys, never women or people, but men or boys, the few intelligent young men will be intrigued by the obiter dicta, or the fragmentary remarks, which they are almost always off the subject. And they'll say, now that's what it's really all about. I've got to get into it. I've got to understand. And then they're taken aside and taught in private individually. The case is the same as that of the police infiltrator who, whenever anything important comes up in meeting, says, I have to talk to you about it after the meeting. He will never discuss anything of significance in the meeting, but only one on one, because he is habitually telling different things to different people. By far the best book on Leo Strauss is Shadia Drui's 1988 The Political Ideas of Leo Strauss. It was meant to be part of an excellence. It may be part of its excellence is related to her awareness that, in fact, the sense in which no woman could be a Straussian. In fact, Strauss said that no woman could be a philosopher. But for many of the bright young boys or men, their purpose for studying with Strauss was to become philosophers. Illustrative of Strauss's method is Shadia Drui's report of debate between the longtime leading Straussians Thomas Pangle and Harry Jaffa, which ran in Claremont Review from fall 1984 through summer 1985 and continued in National Review. Is that Buckley's publication on November 20th to 29th, 1985. Pangle had implied that for Socrates, moral virtue had no application to the really intelligent man, the philosopher. Moral virtue only existed in popular opinion, where it served the purpose of controlling the intelligent majority. Elsewhere in the debate, Pangle implied that for Strauss, philosophy had disproven religious faith. As the fight continued, Pangle states that Strauss had characterized America's distinctiveness as modern, which for the Straussians is one of the worst terms of abuse. Harry Jaffa found Pangle's interpretation completely foreign to his own understanding of his teacher and a friend of 30 years. In Shadia Drui's summary, Jaffa observes that such a vision of Strauss is Nietzschean and that he denounced Pangle for having perverted the legacy of Leo Strauss. How is this contradiction possible? As Drury says, Strauss taught students such as Jaffa and Pangle different things. The esoteric or supposedly secret teaching, which was inoculated into Pangle, Bloom, Warner, Dannhauser, and many others, including reportedly Bloom's protege Paul Wolfowitz, was indeed pure Nietzsche. In fact, the version of which Pangel represented in that 1984 to 85 debate, as outrageous as it may seem to Jaffa, was greatly watered down. From Nietzsche to Strauss, only the names have been changed, as to say, to begin with what Nietzsche called the Superman, or the next man Strauss calls the philosopher. The philosopher Superman is that rare man who can face the truth that there is no God, that the universe cares nothing for men or mankind, and that all of human history is nothing more than an insignificant speck in the cosmos which no sooner began than it is vanished forever without a trace. There is no morality, no good and evil, and of course, any notion of afterlife is an old wives' tale. In a eulogy for a colleague, Strauss said, I think he died as a philosopher without fear but also without hope. But the great majority of men and women, on the other hand, is so far from ever being able to face the truth that it virtually belongs to another species. Nietzsche called it herd and also the slaves. They require the boogeyman of threatening God and of punishment in the afterlife, and the fiction of moral right and wrong. Without these illusions, they would go mad and run riot, and any social order would collapse. And since human nature never changes, according to the Strauss, this will always be so. And this is the idea necessitated from um, the Kantians, through the Nietzscheans, through Joseph the Maestro, and all these people, through their attacks on deism, which is the idea that man must believe in God because it's reasonable, to this attack on reason as being a way to know God. Um, Now we believe that man must believe in God even if he doesn't believe in God. Um, and there's no way to make him believe in God, or that it's reasonable for him to believe in God. So he has to be forced. And this is where the idea of the religious state comes in, which is where Hegel comes in. Um, and this is all transformed by these groups, by these salons, following the conservative revolution, following the Counter-Enlightenment, which dredged these ideas, and a lot of these people, like Berdyaev or whatever, were steeped in these ideas. They follow these ideas, and they're people within their circles turn it into Christian form of traditionalism. But actually, subconsciously, it's all of these things boiling around in the back of their head: nihilism and Kantianism, and all of this. Uh, Anything else about Allan Bloom and Plato? Allan Bloom interprets Plato's Republic. I guess this is his notes on Allan Bloom, or on Plato's Republic. But they don't have the actual quote. I mean, here's one quote. Socrates' view is perfectly consistent with stealing from or killing an enemy just so long as he is not made more unjust. The Socratic teaching that a good society requires a fundamental falsehood is the direct opposite of that of the Enlightenment, which argues that society could dispense with lies and count on selfish calculation to make men loyal to it. The soul in which reason is most developed will abound with thoughts usually connected with selfishness, lust, and vice. The philosopher's public speech must be guided by prudence rather than love for truth. It is obvious that a man can love the truth without telling it. The silent lesson would seem to be that it is indeed possible to possess intellectual virtue without what later came to be called moral virtue. Um, the Republic finally teaches that justice as total dedication to the city cannot be simply good for the philosopher, and what hence is somewhat questionable for other men as well. But there is one kind of doing good to one's friends which is beneficial to the philosopher. There are some young men in whom the soul delights, for they have souls akin to his own and are potential philosophers. He must also carry on a contest with the city for the affections of its sons. Socrates, by curing Glaucon of his lust for tyrannical pleasures, can indulge his own lust for beautiful souls, while at the same time acting the part of the good citizen who defends his city. The tyrant and the philosopher are united in their sense of their radical incompleteness and their longing for the wholeness in their passion and in the single mindedness. They are truly dedicated men. Um, I don't know. There's not much more about Plato other than if you hear people quoting Plato's Republic as some sort of fascist outline, it's coming from these people. It's coming from Allan Bloom and the Chicago School and the Nietzschean interpretation, which is completely falsified. And I know, I think Jay Dyer's referred to this many times. Uh, if you look at Plato, Jay Dyer attacks republicanism. Um, I mean, if you look at something like the French Revolution, um, in Rosebush of War by Louis the XI, he advocates for a republican constitutional monarchy. Why? Because it's viewed as in an educated society, it's the only way to run a society. Um, Whereas the concept of imperium is on the side of the neocons. It's on the side of people who are cynical about humankind. They're cynical about the capacities of man, and therefore you can only have an imperium under a monarchy. Um, so I don't want to go on with this article. Um, but that's in the Children of Satan pamphlet that the LaRouche movement was handing out 2004, and they were being attacked by Lynn Cheney, who was formulating a lot of the national education of universities. Here's an article on what the real Plato's concept of the one is. How long are we in? 2 hours and 30 minutes. Still have 6 followers, so that's good. Please, all 6 followers, give a thumbs up. Um, and I'll keep doing videos. I won't go back into my hole. That's why I went into my hole. It's not because I work 60 hours a week. It's because I didn't get enough likes. Plato's the one. Is this even worth reading? Let's see. I don't know. I mean, I think we've proven, I mean, kind of negatively, what Plato means, how it's um, not this concept, this chain of being concept that Dyer always talks about, where everything is all is one. This concept that completely adverse to what Plato was saying. I don't think we need to read this article. I want to wrap it up as soon as possible. There's also the Barlam argument. This is one of Jay Dyer's favorite arguments. So Barlam and Gregory of Palamas, Gregory Palamas. So you're stupid. You can't even say Gregory Palamas. Uh, the connection between the one and the many is the Platonic ideas idei, or forms, Platon wrote. The Orthodox Church had traditionally talked about the difference between the essence, ouisa, and the power, or energy, energia, of God, or what are sometimes described as the nature and the will of God. A difference is established between God as he really is and God as he reveals himself to man. God's nature is infinitely different from man, they say, and therefore incommunicable. Um, this is from the Renaissance and the rediscovery, the Renaissance and Plato and the rediscovery of the Greeks, by Torbjorn. Torbjorn, it's a Swedish name, I think. Gerlerup. The subject of the argument. No, that's not where it was. Platon in his fall. No. God's nature is infinitely different from man's, they say, and therefore incommunicable. Man can, however, strive towards God and the understanding his works by following the will or energy of God. Ultimately, man can become deified, which does not mean that he will become gods, but that we let the will of God guide us and we become children of God. Platon and his followers had a view that the Platonic idea or forms were a part of the energy of God, and as we comprehend them, and as we can comprehend him. That is, man is closely related to God in the capacity to more and more fully comprehending God's energy through the help of ideas. Petrarch's friend, Barlaam, was involved in a dispute with a monk from Athos, Gregory Palamas, on this subject already in the mid 1300s. The subject of the argument was the light of God. Palamas characterized the essence of God as incommunicable, while the energy was the uncreated light of God, through which God communicates with the creation via faith and grace. Barlaam agreed on the issue of the light of God, but added that reason had to be included. Palamas disagreed because it placed man too close to God. The view the Orthodox Platonists had on this difference between the essence and energy of God is very similar to the view Nicholas of Cusa of the Council of Florence of the Filioque doctrine later came to develop. We cannot know the truth, he wrote, but we can strive towards it. Cusa used the metaphor of the circle and the polygon, showing the species difference between the two. Even if the polygon has an infinite number of sides, it cannot become a circle. Such is the nature of the relation between man and God. Everything we know about God can only be known as approximation. Cusa wrote, just as the polygon can only approximate the circle. What was the importance of this for the debate about Filioque? Well, the Orthodox said that the Holy Spirit proceeded only from the Father. Platon's view, and on the differences in other writings, that the Orthodox view is not so different from the Roman one, that the Holy Spirit proceeds from both the Father and the Son. The true nature of God is always hidden from man, he explained. The Trinity and other attributes of God are not the true nature of God, but God given revelations that help us human beings get an approximated understanding of the mysteries so great that it cannot be grasped by us otherwise. Thus, in reality, all parts of the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, proceed from the hidden essence of God, but as the created energy of God, the Holy Spirit can be said to proceed from the Son as well as from the Father. It's kind of a dumb. Student of Platon, Johannes Bessarion delivered a famous lecture in favor of union on April 13th, 1439, based on Platonic principles. Bessarion got a great deal of help from his teacher Platon, as well as good friends in the West, Traversari and Cusa, but the arguments were his own. The importance of this lecture was that Bessarion came up with a solution which made it possible for the parties at the Council of Florence to agree. Before Bessarion came up with a solution, the delegates were quarreling about whether the Orthodox Church should rewrite its creed to transform itself into an exact copy of the Roman Church. The Orthodox representatives were against this, of course, since the main point of the difference was that the Orthodox Church admitted only one source of the Holy Spirit, the Father, and the Roman Church, two, Father and Son. Bessarion proposed that two should be looked at as one, or rather, the Greek and Latin creeds should be viewed as the same, even though the texts were different. After this disclosure, the Eastern representatives agreed on the reinterpretation of the creed in accordance with the Platonist interpretation of the Filioque, the Trinity being the Creator and the creative Christ and the created Holy Spirit, or as they explained it then, two hypostases, one action, one productive power, and one product due to the substance and hypostasis of the Father and the Son. The union was accomplished based on the agreement in this principle, while the differences in the rites and text remained the same. Bessarion stayed in the West after the union, continuing to work zealously for the unification with other churches, first the Armenians, then the Jacobites and Ethiopians, and the Syrians, and the Chaldeans and Maronites. At this time, he also wrote an article to refute accusations of Mark of Ephesus against the council. He also wrote a defense of Plato against the opponents of Plato and translated Xenophon's Memorabilia about Socrates in Latin. Bessarion worked closely with Cusa and Pope Nicholas V, an example of which can be seen in the translation of the works of Archimedes. The Pope had ordered the translation in the 1450s. 1950s. This aim, he used a manuscript that had apparently been imported by Chrysolera's 60 years earlier. Jacopo da Cremona translated it, and two copies were sent for proofreading, one to Cusa and the other to Bessarion. Cusa wrote a treatise on geometry, complementis, De Mathematicis Complementis, after receiving the translations of Archimedes and sent a copy to Bessarion. Attacks against the Union, and this is the council that attempted to unify uh, Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church, and which all the Orthodox bishops accepted. Now, the Dyer crowd will say that all of these Orthodox bishops were bribed, etc., etc. Let's go on. In the East, the Union of Florence was not publicly proclaimed until 1425, a decade later in the Church of Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, but on May 29, 1453, the Turks, led by Muhammad II, conquered the city, which was renamed Istanbul, marking the end of the Byzantine Empire. After the fall of Constantinople, the old leader of the Orthodox Church, who was a friend of the Union, was forced out and replaced by Patriarch uh, Gennadios Scholarios, who repudiated the Union. In this, the Patriarch was following the only participant at Florence who did not sign. Saint Mark of Ephesus, Mark had been canonized for refusal after his death in 1444. Many of the friends of the Union were persecuted when they returned to the east from the council. The Greek metropolitan of Kiev and all Russia, Isidore, who had been one of the major architects of the Union at the council, returned to Moscow in 1441 as a Roman cardinal, but was rejected by the church and state, arrested and forced to flee to Lithuania. The Orthodox Patriarch Scholarius had written several works against Plethon and Western Platonists even before the rift between the churches became final. In his Against Plethon and against Greek polytheists, he accused Plethon of being a hedonist and proudly proclaimed that Aristotle was superior to Plato. After writing this, he ordered all the works of Plethon to be burned, as well as some of those of Plethon's students. In the West, the main enemy of the Platonists was George of Trebizond, whose comparison of the philosophers Aristotle and Plato was written in 1458. How does this even work? I see. Renaissance and counter-Renaissance. So here we have some kind of embarrassing information surrounding the Philoloque problem and the Council of Florence problem, which the Neo-Orthodox are vociferous about going on. Renaissance and Counter-Renaissance. The Union died, but the fight continued. The Greek project, the revival of Plato, and the work at the Council of Florence survived. In the 1400s and the early 1500s, discoveries were made in the arts and mathematics. The first modern nation-states were founded at the end of the 1400s by Francis Louis XI and England's Henry VII. Industries and manufacturers were promoted, and the grandchildren of the book hunters supported journeys of exploration all over the globe with the establishment of the first nation states, the first steps to the Industrial Revolution, and the hope for creating a world without relative poverty and hunger. Had been taken. Soon, artists like Piero della Francesca, Leonardo da Vinci, and Raphael Sanzio, to name just a few, would revolutionize painting. The arts developed, and although this development lies beyond the scope of this report, it still positively shapes the daily life of all of us minute by minute. The tragedy is that the development of mankind since the Renaissance has been interrupted repeatedly by unnecessary wars and disasters. The evils that followed in the 1500s during the so-called Little Dark Age, religious warfare, colonialism, and the horrendous series of wars leading to the 30 Years' Wars are such examples. Instead of using the Aristotelian opposition to stop the Renaissance, its enemies decided to pervert it from within by introducing counterculture among the youth. Similar to counterculture of the 1960s, they insisted on a revolution of the senses. The early Renaissance Platonist focus on the human mind was to be replaced by the emphasis on sensuality and extra sensuous occult experiences. Now, this always the LaRouches always make it out to be some giant conspiracy. It could just be the psychology. I mean, there is a conspiracy among the oligarchy, but their psychology is that they sway from one thing to the next. And there obviously is a Aristotelian logical culmination that leads to focusing on the extra sensuous and the occult. It's the same issue of Kantianism. Nowhere can this be seen more clearly than in the arts. The great achievement of the Renaissance was to rediscover linear perspective and rediscover ways to portray not only the bodily appearance of people, but also their souls, the notion of the mind. After a while, the Platonic method of painting was developed by artists like Piero, Leonardo, and Raphael, and that's the basis for the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, where Ruskin and Benjamin Jowett come from. It was replaced by a sensual revolution. Pornographic painters earned huge sums. It became fashionable to use mythological subjects for paintings. Why? Because these allowed the painters to depict sexual intercourse between naked men and women and even children disguised as naked angels. Many of the works of Michelangelo clearly show this tendency to emphasize sensual experience and the athletic appearance of the body over the mind. Interested readers can compare the paintings of Michelangelo in the Vatican Sistine Chapel to those of Raphael, also in the Vatican. Perform a thought experiment. How would Michelangelo have painted Raphael's School of Athens, where the great intellectuals of antiquity and modernity are depicted in dialogue taking place in temporal eternity? Would Raphael have painted Christ, God, and the angels and saints as naked athletes as Michelangelo did? And the answer is no. Much of this sensuous revolution was falsely labeled Platonism, as in the case of the unfortunate translator of Plato, Marsilio Ficino, whose occult Platonic theology, that's the work called Platonic Theology, Marsilio Ficino, was anything but Platonic. The seemingly Platonist oration on the dignity of man of Pico della Mirandola, a student of Fiano, which extols the virtue of man's creative powers, nonetheless shows this tendency. The oration starts out by referring to the hidden wisdom of God, which only a chosen elite among mankind has the capacity to discover. Thus, the dignity of the whole humanity has been perverted in the dignity of the few. Or as Pico writes, openly to reveal the people the hidden mysteries and the secret intentions of the highest divinity, which lay concealed under the hard shell of the law and the rough vestures of language. What else could be this but uh, throw holy things to dogs and to straws, strew gems among swine? The decision, consequently, to keep such things hidden from the vulgar and to communicate them to the initiate, among whom alone, as St. Paul says, wisdom speaks, was not counsel of human prudence, but a divine command. And the philosophers of antiquity scrupulously observed this caution. Um, I am drawn to think of uh, Dugan's view through Rene Guénon and also Seraphim Rose's view through Rene Guénon and Julie Savola, where they believed that Sufism was the only lasting initiatic religion. And both of these individuals argue no, Sufism is not the only lasting initiatic religion, that the hesychast system under the Steritz elders is also an initiatic form of Christianity, and that every single other form of Christianity is too universalized to be Christianity, to be an initiatic, authentic religion. And what is central to this is kind of this guru system of secret knowledge, this system of being outside of the common man. That's the objective of the hesychast, which is not just a clerical pursuit, but a pursuit of the lay people. And like I said, all of these philosophers that were steeped in traditionalism at the same time that they were steeped in nihilism, Tolstoyism, Dostoevskyism, um, they all had starets, elders from Optinapustin Monastery, and certain individuals like Lyotnev, um, who was considered like an extremely holy philosopher, supported the Bolshevik Revolution as a means to purge Russia of humanism that was practiced by the Romanovs. Um, so, continuing the article, all talk about the differences between Aristotle and Plato should cease, Pico states. We have proposed a harmony between Plato and Aristotle, where Aristotle would provide the rational method and Plato a method for magical, Kabbalistic investigations. Now, am I in complete agreement with how the Council of Florence would have gone over? No, but is this dubious history related to what shut it down, and it does not seem like divine intervention. It seems like a political Turkish intervention. Um, so the Hesychast tradition also commonly has this charge of being Kabbalistic. And before Palamas, you have the direct line of Simeon the New Theologian. And his biographer and one of his closest associates was Niketas Stethetos. Niketas Stethetos. And he wrote the life of Simon the New Theologian. But he also formulated, based on this essence energy distinction, um, the tenfold hierarchy parallel to the Kabbalistic belief in successive emanations known as the Sephria. Um, Stithos decad had affinities with the decads of both foregoing theories, Kabbalistic and Pythagorean decads, although it cannot be identified with either. They're not identical. It has roots in the conception of the celestial hierarchy or concatenation formulated by St. Dionos the Areopagite. The hierarchy constitutes a threefold structure, each level of which consists of three orders of ranks of celestial intelligences, giving a total of 9 such interlocking and mutually participating orders. The function of the lowest of these orders, that of angels, has two aspects. The first is to transmit the divine grace and illumination, which is received from the God through the meditation of the orders about it. The order below it, the human order, that had taken whole, thus represents the 10th order. The second is convert the human intelligence, the finest of all of the offerings that can be made by this order, so that it mounts upward and stage by stage returns again through the meditation of the celestial hierarchy to the state of union with the divine source, and in this way achieves divination. The double meditation, descending and ascending, constitutes the cyclical movement. So there is this Kabbalistic, direct Kabbalistic link to Simeon the New Theologian and Palamas. It is not some sort of nail in the coffin link, but I hear people saying it, and I wanted to provide that. In terms of Barlam, too, you have Father John Meyerdorff, who was uh, one of these St. Vladimir ROCOR, St. Vladimir Seminary uh, ROCOR theologians around um, Berdayev, and he actually tries to show that Barlam was a Byzantine heretic rather than a Roman Catholic one, and simultaneously classifies him as a nominalist and a Platonist wrapped in one. It kind of seems like to actually prove some of these things that Dyer um, purports, you have to do all sorts of mental gymnastics, like trying to make Platonists into nominalists. Meyerdorff's doctrinal dissertation on Palamas is considered to have transformed the opinion of the Western Church regarding Palamism. Before his study of Palamas, Palamite theology was considered to be curious and sui generis example of medieval Byzantine's intellectual decline. Meyerdorff's landmark study on Palamas, however, sets Palamas firmly within the context of Greek patristic thought and spirituality, with the result that Palamism is now generally understood to be a faithful witness to the long-standing Eastern Christian emphasis on deification, theosis, as the purpose of the divine economy in Christ. Um, so, one of the points I'm trying to make here too is that this is introduction of Neo-Orthodoxy, the ROCOR group, and these people around Berdayev, and we have some quotes later to prove this. But there's actually this where Jay Dyer and these individuals will say, well, there's been this firm tradition that's been since day one, 1 BC, or 1 AD, uh, 1 BC, um, of the Desert Fathers and the Homoousian Fathers, all the way up through Gregory Palamas to the ROCOR tradition. This isn't true. There's actually gaps, um, significant gaps, and most of the Palamite tradition was confined to Mount Athos for most of the time after Palamas. And there was actually reforms that were anti-Palamite, um, within the Orthodox Church, especially the Russian Orthodox Church. And it's not until the Enlightenment, when these translations come to Russia, that this happens. And basically, second generation after that, you have this Neo-Orthodoxy developing out of Berdayev, Nikolai Berdayev. Russian emigre theologians rediscovered the ascetic theology of St. Gregory Palamas. From the rediscovery, according to Payne, Palamas theology became the basis for an articulation of Orthodox theology identity apart from Roman Catholic and Protestant influences. Florovsky, who Jay Dyer often cites, and Lawsky opposed the efforts of the Slavophile movement to identify a uniquely approach to Orthodox theology. They advocated instead a return to the Greek fathers in what Florovsky called a neo-patristic synthesis. Payne characterizes the work of Georges Florovsky and Vladimir Lawsky as having set the course for Orthodox theology in the 20th century. Metropolitan Hilarion Alexeyev identifies 5 main streams within the theology of the Paris school. The first associated with the names of Archimandrite Cyprian, Father Georges Florovsky, Vladimir Lawsky, Archbishop Basil, and Father John Meyendorff, was dedicated to the cause of patristic revival. Florovsky, Vladimir Lawsky, disciples of Nikolai Berdayev, and Meyendorff as well. I've read biographies of Florovsky say he consumed, devoured Soliev and Berdayev and all of these individuals. They maintained these correspondences, etc. The second stream, represented in particular by Father Sergius Bulgakov, who was directly part of the Sophiology circles, which we've talked about before, is rooted in the Russian religious renaissance of the late 19th century and early 20th century. Here, the influence of Eastern patristics was interwoven with German idealism, Kant, Hegel, obviously the preconditions of Nietzsche, probably not Nietzsche himself, but basically buying into Nietzsche's reasoning for the West, meaning like, oh, well, the West ultimately leads to nihilism because Nietzsche was right, but he just wasn't right about the East. In the religious views of Vladimir Soliev stream, the other major sophiologist. The third prepared the ground for the liturgical revival in the Orthodox Church and related to the names of Father Nicholas Afanasiev and Father Alexander Shmeman. Characteristic of the fourth stream was the interest in Russian history, literature, culture, and spirituality, the stream belonging to G. Fedotov, K. Mochilovsky, Konchevik, Sergius Chetyakov, A. Kartashev, and Zernov. I don't really know much about these individuals, but once again, it's more about history and literature rather than anything else. And then the fifth stream developed traditions of Russian religious philosophical thought and was represented by Lawsky, S. Frank, L. Shestov, and Father Basil Zenkovsky. And once again, this is another Lawsky that was closely aligned with Berdayev and all of the white Russian emigres around the Berdayev Salon. One of the central figures of the Russian Paris was Nikolai Berdayev, who belonged to none of these groups, despite the fact that he spawned the majority of them. According to Michael Gibson, Lawsky's paradigm pivots on a double-sided narrative that posits a theological failure of the West characterized as rationalist and philosophical, the antithesis of which is the unbroken Eastern theological tradition of pure apophaticism and mistio-ecclesial experience. Florovsky spurns the new soteriology through his insistence that orthodoxy is under a Babylonian captivity of the Catholic Church, despite being traditional himself. So Vladimir Moss, who's a Russian historian, writes about the new soteriology. And you find out that Father Romanides is one of the major um, new soteriologists, and this has to do with denying original sin and all of these things. But it was actually caused by this incredibly anti-Western view of George's Florovsky, and anti-Western view of some of these white emigre that moved to the West and who were influenced heavily by um, Western anti-rationalism, by Kantianism, etc. Um, and despite being traditional, they still spawned the new soteriologists uh, who basically said we have to wipe out all the Western influence, we have to wipe out Saint Augustine, and we have to start merely with the Greek texts. Um, Florovsky thus became. Here's another quote, I think by Moss. Florovsky became part of the great emigration of Russian intelligentsia, which also included Nikolai Berdyaev, Sergei Bulgakov, Nicholas Losky, his son Vladimir Losky, Alexander Shmemin, and John Meyerdorf, the latter two of whom followed Florovsky as dean of St. Vladimir's Orthodox Theological Seminary. So um, here's some of my notes. Berdyaev worked hand in hand with Jacques Maritain when he moved to Paris, the leading Neo-Thomist and personalist in France, and this becomes influential in Catholic traditionalism, as well as the John Paul II sect. Just like Leninist Orthodoxy nun Maria Skoptsova, who tried to assassinate Trotsky over a Leninist dispute, she moved to Paris and became a saint of the Orthodox Church. The Martinist Paris-St. Petersburg connection discussed by Vladimir Moss is no conspiracy. It's proven by this back and forth between Paris and France, or Paris and St. Petersburg, where the Martinists initially moved through networks that were set up by Joseph de Maistre as a ambassador for Savoy. Maritain and the Spirit magazine circle influenced both the fascist communitarian personalism of Jacques Monnier and the communitarian anarchism of Saul Alinsky. Now, this is from like the Spirit magazine. I think Monnier was a contributor there too. They were all part of the same organization. Alinsky was not, obviously, but they were extremely close friends. And communitarianism of Obama comes from work with the Alinskyite uh, Weatherman group. It also produced the Swiss Europe of Regents fascism of the Congress of Cultural Freedom's Denis de Rougemont, which everybody thinks the CCF is like completely liberal. It's not. It's actually made up of all these people that are advocating the return to the Dark Ages. And he was a member of the Spirit magazine. This was a throwback to the clergy plan. Humanitarian personalism was the brainwashing program used at the Vitiate schools, especially Uriash's night monk training program, which is now the model for Steve Bannon's Gladiator School, and which produced the next generation of the French right that today is under Le Pen and Alain de Benoit, who is the friend of Alexander Dugan, and Le Pen is obviously being funded and Benoit are being funded by Constantine Malafiev and the St. Basil the Great Foundation. This is a proven fact, all under the direction of the KGB, the former KGB general Leonid Reshkinov. And this is me copying a reply to one of Jay's trolls that came and attacked me. It's of no bother to you that somebody like that most of the core ROCOR theologians, the Loskys, Florovsky, were disciples groomed from the Salon of the Christian theosophist Nikolai Berdyaev. And he called himself this. Berdyaev was influential to Father Seraphim Rose's teacher Alan Watts as well, who was also a disciple of Dmitry Mitronovic, Peter Ouspensky, Gurdjieff, and Guénon. Berdyaev was under the influence of Soloviev, who was yet another Christian theosophist in the same tradition of Claude St. Martin. Soloviev and Berdyaev spawned the entire tradition of philosophers mentioned in the quote below practically. These two theosophists were also Sophiologists, a movement which wished to add Sophia as the fourth person of the Trinity. Both of these individuals were right-wing Bolsheviks initially who supported the 1917 revolution, including Solyev's artistic collaborator Alexander Blok, who wrote an encomium to Mikhail Bakunin. Sergei Chevich was the spiritual father of both Nikolai Berdyaev and Vladimir Lorsky. It was the Russian Starets system which promoted the revolution of socialism against humanitarianism, humanism, I mean. They egged on the mess of philosophers too. Jay Dyer is rushing to cover up the inconvenient truths about Neo-Orthodoxy. One of his jobs is to make Neo-Orthodoxy seem compatible with the traditions of the past. We are supposed to forget about all the reforms that had weeded out this kind of garbage in Russia until the Enlightenment practically. Most of Jay's arguments come from these sociology-spawned ROCOR theologians. I quote Jay Dyer, Lorsky is great. Just as an example. Jay Dyer. In 1903, here's one of Lorsky's quotes, Nikolai Lorsky's quotes, just as evidence proving this point. In 1903, Berdyaev and Bulgakov came to St. Petersburg in order to found a new journal, Voprosi Zinzi, Problems of Life. They asked me, as one of the less compromised politically than the others, to obtain permission in my name from the government to publish the journal. I complied, but unfortunately the journal continued for 1 year only. Much work is needed by such laymen as Berdyaev, this is another quote from Lorsky, Berdyaev, who show that the defects in tradition may be removed without damage to the foundations of the Church. By expressing the essential truths of Christianity in new and original terms, different from the style of traditional theology, such philosophers as Berdyaev awaken an interest in Christianity in many minds that turned away from it and may succeed in drawing them back into the Church. Men like Berdyaev lend powerful support to the work of preserving and developing the civilization that defends the absolute value of personality, and for this, all praise and honor to them. Another quote, Berdyaev belongs to the group of thinkers who strive to develop a Christian world concept and whose work is the most original expression of Russian philosophical thought. It was begun more than 100 years ago with the founders of the Slavophil movement, Ivan Kuryevsky and Komiakov, but came into its own much later under the influence of the chief sociologist Vladimir Solyov, who also created the Russian idea, the Russian messianic idea that Dostoevsky shared. A whole galaxy of religious philosophers appear after Solyov. Among them are Turbetskoy, Fedorov, Father Pavel Florensky, who heavily influenced Georges Florovsky. That's where Jay Dyer gets his Cantor arguments, which and Gödel arguments, which are essentially not wrong, but those arguments actually come from a Platonic tradition. Father Servius Bulgakov, Berdyaev, Korsavin, Frank Alexiev, Ilin, Father Vasily Zedkovsky, Father G. Florovsky, Spektorsky, and yeah, that's another quote from Lorsky. This is a quote from Berdyaev that I think illustrates how Bolshevism and Orthodoxy under the Russian Church are like this, and how somebody like Dugan, who is a national Bolshevist, is trying to use these ex-KGB guys. I don't think Putin is very close to this, or as close to this, even though he shares a spiritual director with Konstantin Malafeev under Tikhon. But this is what Berdyaev says. The Russian people did not achieve their ancient dream of Moscow, the Third Rome, which is the Dostoevskian Solyov idea. The ecclesiastical schism of the 17th century revealed that the Muscovite Tsardom is not the Third Rome. The Messianic idea of the Russian people assumed either an apocalyptic form or a revolutionary form. And there occurred an amazing event in the destiny of the Russian people. Instead of a Third Rome in Russia, the Third International was achieved. And many of the features of the Third Rome pass over to the Third International. The Third International is also a holy empire. It is founded on the Orthodox faith. The Third International is not international, but a Russian national idea. And that's from Nikolai Berdyaev, who produced most of these. He provided the initial worldview, the Weltanschauung, of all of these ROCOR emigre people who went into the United States. And the last thing that we'll end on here, since we're now at 3 hours, uh, yeah, I'm Catholic. If you are a Catholic or not a Catholic, please like. There's 7 people watching and nobody's liking this. It makes me feel sad. I bet they downloaded it. I bet they're taking notes so that they can debunk me later on. Oh man, they're gonna hit me where it hurts. Um, what I'll end on is some of the notes I had concerning these ROCOR emergés that came to America and their proximity to William F. Buckley, namely George de Morgenschild, who worked out of or who met with Oswald at the emigre palace, the ROCOR palace. It was more of a fancy house where some of the Romanovs were living in New York. Um, I don't know if I have that up anymore. But essentially, even the official story says that Oswald was around these ROCOR, white Russian emerge. Um, and George de Morgenschild worked for William F. Buckley and family, who obviously tied in deep with the Georgetown Jesuits. You know what? I don't need the notes to tell you that. That's it. That's pretty much it. So there's this ROCOR connection to these groups. One thing I never really looked into completely was if there was any ROCOR connection to the Council for National Policy. Because there's obviously that huge Knights of Malta connection. And there's all these other cults, the Moonies and whatnot. The ideology of the PNC / CNP is in. Oh, man. Of course, it doesn't freaking read. I think it's some sort of app that picks up Twitter posts. I don't really care about that anyway. Anyway, I don't care. That's a good thing to look into. People should look into that. I'm interested in Catholic history. Might be interested in acquiring. Well, you can always suggest, send me questions or whatever. I read old magazines at gmail.com if you have questions, or you can post them down below in the comments. Now, the reason why you guys like and subscribe is a lot of these videos get buried if they don't get likes. And therefore, whenever you issue a debunking, like something like the Holy Order of Man connection with Abbot Herman from Seraphim Rose's monastery, nobody knows about that. That's buried on the internet. And when people type in Jay Dyer or Seraphim Rose on YouTube, it ends up not being, uh, it doesn't come up in the search results. And that's like a critical fact. And it's not a logical argument. I don't know if I explained this at the beginning, but we're not interested in logical arguments. Um, Logic is a mathematical system, okay? If you have the grammar right first, this is a grammatical practice. This is what John Irving used to talk about before he became a Mormon. What he used to focus on is collecting the data first and collecting all those little nefarious things, those little things that don't make sense, those little contradictions, and then weaving that into the arguments. Um, can you please elaborate on this topic uh, at 3 hours? I don't know. We can make a video addressing specifically the old believers. I don't know too much about the subject myself. But yeah, we can definitely do another video on that. It's nice, to read the feedback and figure out what you guys want to know about. Um, all I know is that Alexander Dugan is one. I know that they are superstitious, and I think they made up a faction of the White Russians, if I remember correctly, of Kerensky, that were part of the White Emigre, but I don't remember. Um, they tend to be part of the peasant romanticism of the Russian idea of the Soviet Empire and right wing Bolshevism. So, anyway, it's been a good time. Uh, I actually didn't see any Dyer trolls in the chat, which is pretty crazy. But we'll see tons of comments flow in later on. They probably don't even want to touch this because it's not, like I'm not trying to nail in the coffin everything. I bring up things that people have to look into in order to debate Dyer. Dyer has this entire canon of theology and arguments that he's read. He has a armory of arguments, but that doesn't mean that he actually has the truth. Dyer obviously is deficient in actually verifying the facts about what he talks about and uh, seeking the truth. Rather, he is a um, kind of a hatchet man in terms of his debates. And I think that can obviously be beaten. The problem is the people that are out there debating him are following the same erroneous U-turn, Kantian U-turn arguments, like Taylor Marshall or whatever. They're all in that sphere of the um, traditionalist heresy. They might not actually believe it themselves, but that's always in the back of their mind because they don't specifically know to reject it. They don't know exactly what they do believe. So most of the people coming at him are from a standpoint, or they're from a standpoint of like this neo-Thomism or this heavily like idea that you can make some sort of philosophical world system out of Thomism rather than a schema of organizing the church's laws and organizing dogma and all of this, which is more of what Thomism is for. So, and for arguing against the Averist heresy in its specific context. So, everybody have a blessed Saturday. Have a blessed Lent. As your penance, you should give me a thumbs up and like and subscribe and send me super chats. And we'll start up a cult of personality around I read old magazines. I'm surprised not to see Captain Slap Happy in the chat. I wonder if he doesn't like the fact that I've ran off for a couple months, but always appreciate those comments. I think we have S90s and New Guy, Lamb, Doc Bungo, Tony G, Italiano. That's right. And I'm a hair BB. All new voices, all new faces. I like it. Have a good night, everybody. If you like, seriously, if you do have a Twitter or something, Jay Dyer mainly uses Twitter. A lot of these Orthodox troll network people use Twitter. Um, at some point, I want to go through the history of my work with Webster Tarpley and uh, actually being inside these when all of the Konstantin Malafeev publications started coming out, how close I was to the Russian networks, and actually the fact that the Russian networks, like trying to decipher the good and bad about them, because obviously the Ukrainian issue, the Russians were largely in the right, but there was a whole other anti-Western part of this which was fundamentally evil, and people who were supporting that anti-Western bent from them are, I don't know, dangerous. I don't want to say dangerous. I don't want to sound like some sort of Fed, but essentially operating outside of their self-interest and their national interest, which is kind of short-sighted. I hope to be on John Bresson's program at some point. I guess with the knowledge I have now, I mean, we have enough material for a good show. I like to be thorough, at least in terms of bringing up things that, if they're true, if further investigation can be nails in the coffin. But you have to find many different fronts to do so, and you have to go back to everything where to a starting point, and that takes a lot. So, and you can't just cherry pick either, which is something I think that Jay Dyer does. I think he does it better than the simpletons like Taylor Marshall or all of these people that try to defend like a romanticized, idealized version of Catholicism and not a historical Catholicism. But yeah, so I'll see you guys later with something. Gonna go back to working 60 hours a week, and maybe during that work, I will think on you. All right, bye. I don't know. I can't shut up.